Hey there and welcome back. If you have reached the end of a long day and you are finally gratefully doing the very thing this whole story is about, getting yourself ready to sleep, then you have come to exactly the right place tonight, because tonight we are going to do that together, slowly and quietly, in another age. Tonight is about the oldest and most ordinary thing in the world, the close of the day, the putting away of the waking hours, the long, gentle business of getting ready for bed, as it was done all across Victorian Britain 150 years and more ago. It is for anyone who knows the particular tiredness of the end of the day, who has felt the relief of the last task finished and the bed at last in sight. And it is a curious comfort, I think, to remember that every soul who ever lived has had to do this same thing, has had to lay the day down and give themselves over to sleep in the grand house and the mean one alike. So come with me, and let us move together through a Victorian evening as the whole country settles toward its rest, and I will show you how it was done by the Duchess and the dairymaid, the banker and the crossing sweeper, each in their own way under the same evening sky. And before we are through, I promise you, we will have climbed the stairs of a great house where a lady was made ready for bed by 3 servants and a warmed pan of coals, and we will have stood in a place where the poorest of the poor paid a penny to sleep, sitting on a bench, leaning on a rope strung across the chamber. And somewhere between those two we will find the long, strange history of how people learn to go to sleep at all. Before we begin to climb the stairs together, let me say just one small thing, the way you might pause on the landing a moment before going up. I do love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what hour it has reached where you are, whether the candles would long since be out where you lie, or whether your evening is only just drawing in. And if you care to set it down in the comments below, I do look through them, and there is a quiet pleasure in the thought that so many of us, scattered across so many places and hours, are all making our way toward the same rest tonight. And if these slow journeys into other times are a thing you would like to find your way back to, you would be very welcome to follow along, and another will come to you in its turn, with no hurry and nothing owed. That is all I will ask. Now let us go in, and up, and begin. Picture this. It is an evening in the 1870s, somewhere in Britain, and the light is going out of the sky. Across the whole country, as the dusk comes down, the same slow change is beginning in 100,000 houses at once, grand and humble, town and country, the drawing of the curtains, the lighting of the lamps, the first thought of bed. In the great squares of the West End, the lamplighter goes from post to post with his little ladder and his flame, and the windows of the tall houses begin to glow. In the mean streets, the one gas lamp at the corner is lit, and behind the cracked panes the rushlight or the cheap dip is kindled. In the unlit country, the farmhouse and the cottage show their single points of candlelight across the fields. And inside all of them, behind every lit window in the land, the same great human business is beginning, the laying down of the day, the long ritual of getting ready for bed. And that is the land we are going to travel through tonight, the Britain of the lit window and the turned-down bed, as it readies itself, rank by rank and room by room, for sleep. Let us begin with the thing that ruled it all, the thing we have almost entirely forgotten in our age of the switch on the wall, the going of the light. For the whole of human history until almost yesterday the day ended when the daylight ended, because to make light after dark was difficult and dear, and so the rhythm of waking and sleeping was set by the sun far more than by the clock. The Victorian was the very generation in which this began to change, in which gas and then, at the very end, electricity began to push the blackness back and let people choose their own hours. But for most of the people, for most of the century, the old tyranny still held. When the light went, the day's real work was over, for fine work could not be done by a flickering flame, and a household that burned much candle or oil or gas was a household spending money it could often ill afford. And so the evening, that soft borderland between the working day and sleep, was lit thriftily and lived quietly, and bed came early by our reckoning, and the whole shape of the evening was set by the simple fact that light was precious and the blackness was vast. That fact, that light was dear and the dark came early, had shaped how people slept for so long that it had left a strange mark on the very pattern of sleep, one that the Victorians were among the last to remember. That there is good reason to believe that in the older world, before cheap light, people did not sleep as we do, in one long unbroken stretch, but in two, that they went down into a first sleep not long after dark, and woke again somewhere in the small hours, and lay awake a while in the quiet of the small hours, praying or talking or simply lying still in the gloom, before sinking into a second sleep until the dawn. The first sleep and the second sleep they were called, and that waking hour between them was once so ordinary that no one thought to remark on it. As the slow bright evening crept in with better light, this old divided sleep slowly faded and was forgotten, until people came to believe that one solid block of sleep was the only natural way. But it lay not far behind the Victorians, this older rhythm, and it is worth carrying with you tonight, the thought that the very shape of sleep itself has a history, and has not always been the thing we take it now to be. Come then into the house at dusk, and watch the lighting up, for the making of light against the coming blackness was the first act of every evening, and a small ritual in itself. In the great house it fell to the servants, and as the daylight failed, a housemaid went her round with her taper and her box of matches, or her spill lit at the fire, moving from room to room to light the lamps and the candles, and to draw the heavy curtains against the dusk. In the gas-lit house there was the soft pop of the gas taking the flame, the hiss of it, the greenish glow steadying to gold within the etched glass globe. In the candle-lit house there was the carrying of the silver or brass candlesticks to their places, the lighting of the branched candelabra on the table. In the poor house there was no round and no servant, only the woman of the place setting a match to the one cheap candle, or the smoking paraffin lamp that must serve the whole family for the evening. Out in the street, meanwhile, the lamplighter went his own round at dusk with his long pole, touching each gas lamp alight in turn down the darkening road, a figure so faithful and so familiar that children set their bedtimes by him, and so, as the dusk came down, the whole country lit its small flames against it, house by house and street by street, and the long evening began. The light itself, that we kindled so easily and thought so little of, was a whole world of trade and making, and it is worth pausing on what those flames were and where they came from. The commonest light of the poor was the tallow candle, the cheap dip made of rendered animal fat, that guttered and stank and smoked and had to be snuffed of its charred wick again and again. Cheaper still was the rushlight, a peeled rush dipped in grease, the dimmest glow of the very poor. Far above them was the wax candle, clean burning and sweet and dear, the light of the church and the rich man's table. And between, by the Victorian age, came the great new thing, the candles of the modern factories, the stearin and paraffin and composite candles turned out by firms whose names became household words. Price's Patent Candle Company above all, whose works lit half the homes of the empire with a clean bright candle the ordinary family could afford. There were the oil lamps too, burning first the colza and the whale oil, and then the new cheap paraffin drawn from coal and rock, giving a steadier, brighter light than any candle. There was the gas, piped from the gasworks through the growing towns, the marvel of the age. And there, at the very end of the reign, in a few grand houses and public chambers, the first cold, astonishing glow of the electric light. Every flame in every bedroom had its price and its maker, and its place in the long climb out of the gloom, and the kind of light a family burned to bed was as sure a mark of its station as the coat on its back. Now let us climb the stairs of the greatest sort of house first, and see how the highest in the land were put to bed, for at the top of the scale the going to bed was scarcely a private act at all, but a kind of stately ceremony performed by many hands. When the family of a great house withdrew to their beds, after the long ritual of the dinner and the drawing-room, each took up a chamber candlestick from the table in the hall, the row of them set out ready, and went up the great staircase in a little procession of separate flames, parting on the landings with their good nights, each to their own apartment. And there in the bedchamber and the dressing-room beyond it, the real work was done by others, for a great lady did not undress herself any more than she dressed herself. Her lady's maid was waiting, and the long, elaborate unmaking of the day's grand appearance began, a business of half an hour or more that turned the magnificent public creature of the evening back into a private woman ready for her bed. Watch the lady's maid at her work, for in the undressing of her mistress we see the whole apparatus of high comfort laid bare. First the jewels are taken off and locked away, then the elaborate evening gown, unhooked and unlaced and lifted off and carried away to be aired and put by, then the corset unlaced at last, the long day's tight imprisonment loosed, and the petticoats and the rest removed one layer at a time until the lady stands in her shift. Then she is helped into her nightgown and her wrapper, and seated at the dressing-table before the looking-glass, and the chief business of the hair begins, the pins drawn out one by one, the elaborate construction of the day's coiffure taken down, the long hair, a woman's crowning glory and seldom cut in all her life, falling free at last, and then the brushing, the famous 100 strokes and more, the maid drawing the brush down the full length of it again and again until it shines, before plaiting it loose for sleep. Creams are smoothed into the face and hands, perhaps, a little lavender water or eau de cologne, and at last, washed and gowned and brushed and tended, the lady is ready, and crosses to the bed that other hands have already warmed and turned down for her, and is left to her prayers and her sleep. Well, the gentleman of such a house had his own attendant, and his own quieter ritual, less elaborate than his wife's, but no less waited upon. His valet, his man, had laid out his nightshirt and his nightcap warming by the fire, and stood ready to help him out of the stiff and complicated evening dress, the coat and the waistcoat and the studs and the boots, taking each thing away to be brushed and put right for the morning. There was the washing at the basin, the cleaning of the teeth, perhaps the winding of the watch and the setting of it by the bed, the nightshirt drawn on, long and white, and reaching to the calf, and over it sometimes a banyan or dressing gown against the chill, and on the head the nightcap that kept the warmth in through the cold hours of an unheated room. And then the man too was ready, and climbed into his side of the great bed, or went through to his own separate chamber, for in houses of the first rank the husband and wife very often slept apart, each in their own grand room, with the dressing-room between, a privacy and a luxury of space that only real wealth could buy. That warmed and turned-down bed the lady crossed to was, itself a small triumph of comfort, and the warming of it tells us much about what luxury truly meant in a cold country before central heating. The bed had been made ready while the family was still at dinner. The housemaid had turned down the covers, and she had run the warming pan between the sheets, the long-handled brass or copper pan filled with glowing coals or embers from the fire, sliding it up and down the bed so that no part of it should strike cold to the climbing in. In the grandest and most comfortable bedrooms there was something better still, the thing that marked real luxury above all others, a fire in the bedchamber itself, laid and lit by the maid, so that the chamber was warm before its occupant came up, and the firelight played on the walls as they fell asleep. A fire in the bedchamber was a thing the poor could scarcely dream of, and the careful middle classes allowed themselves only in illness or the bitterest weather, for it meant a second scuttle of coal and a second grate to clean. But in the houses of the rich, every principal bedroom had its own fire burning of a winter evening, and to lie warm in a warmed bed in a warmed room while the frost gripped the world outside was perhaps the very summit of Victorian physical comfort. Now let us come down a story in the world, out of the great house and into the comfortable home of the prosperous middle classes, the merchant and the professional man, and the well-to-do tradesman, for here the routine was much the same in spirit, but done largely by the family's own hands. Such a household kept servants, but not the small army of the aristocracy. There might be a cook and a housemaid and a nursemaid, but no lady's maid and no valet. And so the master and mistress, for the most part, undressed themselves. The mistress brushed out her own hair before her own glass, or had a daughter help her with the back hooks of her gown. The routine of washing and undressing and night-gowning was managed without attendance, in a bedroom that was comfortable and well furnished, but where the fire, more often than not, was unlit, and the chamber struck cold. The bed was warmed, but very likely by the mistress or the housemaid with a stone bottle or a warming pan, rather than by a fire kept burning till morning. The comfort was real and solid and respectable. The good mahogany bedstead and the clean linen and the piled blankets, but it was a comfort that the family largely made for itself, without the many waiting hands that smoothed the path of the truly rich. Come down another step, into the small terraced house of the lower middle class, the clerk and the shopkeeper and the schoolmaster, the great striving respectable multitude who kept perhaps a single servant, a maid of all work, or none at all. Here the going to bed was a thriftier business, watched over by the careful economy that ruled the whole house, for in such a home every candle end and every lump of coal was counted. The family sat together of an evening in the one warm room, and when bedtime came, the fire was raked out or banked low, the one lamp carried up or its light shared by a candle apiece, and the household climbed to the cold bedrooms above. There was no fire upstairs save in grave illness. The chambers were icy in winter, the water in the ewer sometimes frozen by morning. The bed was warmed, if at all, by a stone hot water bottle or a hot brick wrapped in flannel, and one undressed quickly and dived beneath the piled blankets and the heavy quilt for warmth. It was a decent, hardy, frugal comfort, the bedtime of the lower middle class, clean and respectable and cold. The candle snuffed the moment one was abed to save the precious wax. The whole family taught from infancy that to burn light and coal needlessly was a small sin. And now we must climb higher than any of these, up the back stairs and into the cold roof of the house, to find the people who had made all the others comfortable and who went to their own beds last of all, the servants. The maid who had lit the lamps and warmed the beds and turned down the covers for the family had her own bed to think of only when all of theirs were seen to, and it was a very different bed indeed. Up under the slates, in the attic chambers that were stifling in summer and bitter in winter, the servants slept, often 2 to a bed and several to a chamber, in plain iron bedsteads with flock or straw mattresses, and a thin allowance of blankets. There was no fire there, and never had been. The light was a single candle end, or a cheap dip to be put out at once, for a servant who sat up reading by candlelight was wasting her master's substance. Worn out by a day that had begun before anyone else's and would begin so again before dawn, the servant washed in cold water from a jug she had carried up herself, said her prayers, and crept into the icy bed in the unheated room at the top of the warm house she kept, the last to lie down and the first to rise, her comfort the very least in all the household she served. Spare a thought before we leave the servant to her short rest, for the maid of all work in the small house, who had no fellow servant to share even the cold attic with, and whose lot was perhaps the loneliest of all. She was a girl, very often of 14 or 15, taken from a poor home or the workhouse, and she did the whole work of the house single-handed from dark to dark, the fires and the grates and the scrubbing and the cooking and the carrying, and she slept alone in the kitchen or the scullery or a windowless cupboard of a chamber, on a makeshift bed, with no company and little kindness and less rest. Hers was the bedtime at the very bottom of the respectable world, the tired child servant lying down alone in the gloom of the basement while the family slept soft above her, and rising in the black cold of the morning to light their fires before they woke. And if we are to be honest about how the Victorians went to bed, we must not leave her out, the little maid-of-all-work, whose unregarded labour made the soft beds of so many others possible. Below even her, though, below the servant and the maid-of-all-work and the frugal clerk, there was a whole vast world of the poor, whose going to bed bore almost no resemblance to any of this, and it is into that world that we must go next, for no honest account of the Victorian night can leave it unlit. We have seen the lady warmed and brushed and tended, and the comfortable family in its mahogany bed, and the servant in her cold attic. Now we must go down into the courts and the cellars and the lodging-houses where the poorest of a rich nation laid themselves down, and see what bedtime meant where there was no bedroom at all. In the crowded courts and rookeries of the great towns, a whole family lived very often in a single room, and in that one chamber they also slept, all of them together, in a way that the comfortable classes could scarcely imagine. There might be one bed, an old iron or wooden bedstead with a flock or straw mattress grey with age, and in it slept the parents and the youngest children, while the older children lay on the floor on a heap of rags or old coats, or on a shakedown of straw in the corner. There was no question of a nightgown. The poor slept in their day clothes or in their underclothes, partly for warmth in the unheated room, and partly because they had no other garments to change into. The same shift or shirt was worn day and night and week after week. There was no washing before bed worth the name, no basin and ewer of clean water, perhaps a single cold tap shared by the whole court at the end of the yard. There was the cold, and the damp running down the walls, and very often the vermin, the bugs in the old bedstead and the fleas in the straw that made sleep a torment. And yet here too the day was laid down and sleep was sought, the children dropping off from sheer weariness, the parents lying down at last from the endless labour of being poor. The human need for rest is the same in the cellar as in the palace, and met it must be, however hard the bed. Below even the family in its one chamber was the world of the homeless and the wandering poor, and for them there was the common lodging-house, the doss-house, where a bed of sorts could be had for a few pence a night. For 4pence a man might have an actual bed in a long room full of cots packed close, the mattresses foul and the company rough and the air thick. For less he might have a share of a berth with a stranger, or a place on the floor. And at the very bottom, for the price of a penny or two, there was the lodging where a man could not lie down at all, but sat on a long bench, and slept leaning forward upon a rope strung tight across the chamber in front of him, his arms over it, and his head on his arms. And in the morning the rope was let down, and the sleepers tumbled awake. The 2-penny rope, it was called, the cheapest sleeping place in the world that was no bed at all, the last resort of the destitute who had nowhere else to lay their heads, and it stands at the very furthest end of the long scale we are travelling tonight, as far from the Duchess in her warmed and curtained bed as it is possible for two human beings under the same evening sky to be. Out in the country, away from the great towns, the poor cottager went to bed in a manner that had changed little in centuries, simple and early and close to the earth. The labourer's cottage was small, often only 2 chambers, and the family slept above in the low chamber under the thatch or the slates, reached by a ladder, or a steep crooked stair, the parents in one bed and the children crowded into another, or into truckle beds drawn out at bedtime. The light was the cheapest tallow dip, or, in the poorest and most old-fashioned places, the rushlight still made at home from rushes and grease as it had been made for generations, and bed came early with the dusk. There was little fuel and less light to spare, and the labour of the land began at first light. The bed was warmed by a hot brick from the hearth, or simply by the bodies in it. The covering was what there was, old blankets and patched quilts and coats laid on top in the cold. It was a hard, plain bedtime, the cottagers', but it had its own deep peace, the early sinking into sleep after the honest labour of the fields, the whole small family breathing together in the one low room under the great country dark and the country silence. Children, in every rank of this world we are travelling through, had their own bedtime, earlier than their elders, and ringed about with its own customs. And the gulf between the children of the rich and the children of the poor was as wide at bedtime as at every other hour. In the great house and the comfortable home there was the nursery, that separate kingdom at the top of the house ruled by the nurse or the nanny, and the children's bedtime was a settled ritual, the bath before the fire, the warmed nightgown, the supper of bread and milk, the saying of prayers kneeling at the nurse's knee, the being tucked into the cot or the small bed, and against the terrors of the dark, the night-light left burning, the little float of wax in a saucer of water, or the small night-lamp glowing through the watches of the night. The children of the poor had no nursery and no nurse and no night-light, only the shared bed or the floor and the gloom. But they too were children, and they too were sung to and told their tales and frightened by their bogies, and dropped off at last clutching whatever rough comfort they had. A rag doll, a younger sibling, a mother's worn hand. Let us pause a moment on that night-light, the little flame left burning for the child afraid of the dark, for it stands for something deep in the Victorian night that we have half forgotten, the sheer power and terror of real darkness. We who can banish the gloom with a touch can hardly grasp what it was to lie in a blackness total and absolute, with the one small flame the only thing between you and a blackness in which anything might move, and the Victorian child, taught to fear hell and ghosts and the dead, lying in that blackness, had real need of the one steady nightlight and its comfort it gave. The nightlights were made for the purpose and sold by the gross. The little squat candles that burned slow and low for hours, the float lights resting on their cork in a glass of water and oil, and the glow of one in a nursery, or in a sick room, or by the bed of the old and the frightened, was one of the small mercies of the age, a tiny flame of company kept burning against the vast indifferent dark of the night. Now let us turn from the people to the things, for you asked to know where the comforts of the bed came from, and what made one bed soft and warm, and another hard and cold, and there is a whole world of making and trade in the furniture of sleep. Begin with the bedstead itself, the frame on which all the rest is piled, for it changed greatly across the century. At the century's beginning the grand bed was still the great wooden four-poster, the carved mahogany or oak frame with its tall posts and its tester roof and its heavy curtains drawn close all round. But as the Victorian age went on a new idea took hold, the idea that such beds, with their hangings and their crevices, were unhealthy, harbouring dust and bugs and stale air, and a new kind of bedstead rose to replace them. This was the bedstead of iron and brass, made above all in Birmingham, the workshop of the world, where great firms turned out bedsteads by the 100,000, the plain japanned iron frame for the cottage and the servant's attic, the handsome brass bedstead with its bright rails and knobs for the comfortable home. The brass bedstead became one of the proudest possessions of the respectable Victorian household, gleaming and modern and easy to keep clean, a thing to be polished and shown, and the cheap iron bedstead, mass-produced and sold for a few shillings, put a proper bed within the reach of millions who had slept on the floor before. Upon the frame went the mattress, and here, more than anywhere, lay the difference between a hard bed and a soft one, for the mattress was a ladder of comfort with many rungs. At the bottom was the straw mattress, the paillasse, a great sack stuffed with straw, cheap and hard and rustling, that grew lumpy and had to be restuffed. Above it the flock mattress, stuffed with flock, the torn-up scraps and waste of the wool and cotton trade, softer than straw, but apt to go into hard knots and lumps. Better still was the mattress of horsehair, curled and springy and long-lasting, the standard of the comfortable home that could be beaten and turned and kept good for many years, and at the top, the softest of all, the feather bed, of which more in a moment. And then, in the second half of the century, came a true revolution in comfort. The sprung mattress, the frame of coiled wire springs that gave beneath the body and bore it up evenly, the ancestor of the bed we sleep on now. First the simpler spring frames, and then the proper sprung mattress, a luxury at first, and then slowly spreading down the ranks. That changed the very feel of lying down. To pile a horsehair or a feather mattress upon a set of springs was to reach a softness and an ease that earlier ages had never known, and it was one of the quiet triumphs of Victorian comfort. The feather bed was the old summit of softness, the thing the comfortable family aspired to and the poor never knew, and it was a real treasure, built up and handed down over the years. It was a great cloth tick stuffed full of feathers and down, the soft breast feathers of geese and ducks above all, plucked and saved and bought and gathered over time, for it took the feathers of a great many birds to fill a bed. The finest and softest and most costly filling was the down, the under plumage of the eider duck and the goose, light and warm beyond anything, the very stuff of luxury. To sink into a well-filled feather bed was to be enfolded and held in a softness that nothing else could give, warm and yielding and deep, and a good feather bed with its matching bolster and pillows was an item of real value, named in wills and given as a wedding portion, the accumulated softness of years. The poor had flock pillows or none, and laid their heads on a rolled coat or a bag of straw. The comfortable had their feather pillows, and the rich had pillows and bolsters of the finest down, cased in the smoothest linen, the head pillowed as softly as the body, every part of the sleeper cradled in the gathered lightness of 1,000 birds. Over the mattress went the sheets, and the sheets too told a story of trade and of comfort, for there was a great difference between the linen of the rich and the cotton of the many and the coarse stuff of the poor. The old and finest material for sheets was linen, woven from flax, cool and smooth and strong, and growing softer with every wash, the sheeting of the great house, kept in the linen press in vast quantities, and marked with the family's initials, numbered and inventoried like treasure. But the Victorian age was the age of cotton above all, and the vast mills of Lancashire, spinning and weaving the cotton of the American and Egyptian fields by steam, poured out cotton sheeting by the mile, cheaper than linen and within the reach of the ordinary family, so that for the first time the labouring classes might sleep between proper sheets at all. The poorest still made do with sheets of coarse, harsh stuff, or with none lying in their blankets. But for the great middle of the nation, the Lancashire cotton mills had worked a quiet revolution, and the clean cotton sheet, washed and bleached and smelling of the open air it had dried in, became one of the plain, reliable comforts of respectable life, the smooth, cool welcome of fresh linen at the end of the day. And the keeping of those sheets clean and sweet was itself a heavy labour, the wash, that stood behind the comfort of every fresh-made bed. Clean bed linen was a mark of decency and a real pleasure, but it was bought at the cost of one of the hardest labours of the household, the weekly wash that came round every week or fortnight, the boiling and the dollying and the wringing and the mangling and the drying and the ironing of the heavy sheets. In the great house, it was done by laundry maids or sent out to a laundress. In the poor house, it was done by the woman herself, in a copper of heated water, her arms in the hot suds for hours, the steam filling the chamber. The reward was the smell and the feel of it, the sheets dried on the line in the wind and the sun, or before the fire, and ironed smooth and folded and laid in the press with lavender or dried herbs between them to keep them sweet, and to be put to bed in fresh changed linen, fresh and crisp and faintly scented, was one of the keenest small pleasures the age afforded, in the cottage as in the castle, the universal comfort of the clean bed. Upon the sheets came the blankets, and warmth in a cold country was a thing measured out in blankets, the number and the quality of them a plain index of a family's comfort. The best blankets were of pure wool, soft and thick and warm, and the most famous of all came from one small town, Witney in Oxfordshire, whose blankets were known across the country and the empire, woven there for centuries by families who had made it their whole trade. A pair of good Witney blankets was a proud possession, bought to last a lifetime and handed on. The comfortable household piled blanket upon blanket as the winter deepened, 3 or 4 or more, the weight of them part of the very feeling of warmth. The poor made do with one thin warm blanket or with none, eking out the warmth with old coats and shawls and whatever could be laid on top. To be cold in bed was one of the commonest miseries of the poor, and one of the things the comfortable most dreaded losing, and so the blanket, plain and woolen and unglamorous, was in truth one of the most precious things in the house, that the very stuff of comfort, and a bed well furnished with good blankets, was a bed in which one might defy the hardest frost the English winter could bring. Today, over the blankets, for heat and for show, went the topmost coverings, the quilt and the counterpane and the coverlet, and here ease shaded into ornament, and the bed became an object of beauty as well as of use. There was the quilt, the wadded coverlet stitched in patterns through its 3 layers, that added a great warmth of its own. There was the white honeycomb or Marcella counterpane, woven in raised patterns, the clean, handsome covering of the respectable bed. There was, in a poor home, the patchwork quilt, pieced together by the women out of every scrap and remnant the household could save. A thing of thrift that was often a work of real beauty too, the bright pattern built up over winters of evening work. And at the very summit of comfort and luxury was the eiderdown, the great light-puffed quilt stuffed with the costly eiderdown, that lay upon the bed like a cloud and gave a warmth out of all proportion to its weight, the crowning softness of the comfortable bed. The poor had their patchwork and their old coats, the comfortable had their Marcella counterpane and their wadded quilt, and the rich had their eiderdown, light as air and warm as a fire, and under it slept as soft and as warm as it was possible for a body to sleep. My son, Doak, we have spoken of warming the bed. Let us look closer at the means of it, for the warming of a cold bed in a cold room was a knightly art with its own instruments. The oldest and grandest was the warming pan, the round brass or copper pan on its long handle, filled with embers and passed up and down between the sheets that hung by so many a hearth. But it had its dangers, for live coals too long in one place would scorch the linen, and it asked a careful hand. Simpler and safer was the hot brick or the flat stone, heated in the oven or by the fire, and wrapped in flannel, and put down at the foot of the bed to warm the feet till morning. Then there was the stone hot water bottle, the great virtue of the Victorian bed, a flat bottle of salt-glazed stoneware made in the Staffordshire and Derbyshire potteries, filled with hot water and stoppered tight and wrapped in a cloth that held its warmth for hours and could not scorch or burn. It became the faithful companion of millions of cold beds, the pig, as some called it for its shape. And at the very end of the century came the soft rubber hot water bottle we know still, yielding and soft against the body, but for most of the age it was the warming pan for the rich, the hot brick for the poor, and the good stone bottle for the great comfortable middle that took the dread chill off the climbing in and let a body fall asleep warm. Now let us look at the washstand. For the washing before bed was a part of the ritual wherever there was the means for it, and the washstand and its furniture were among the most universal pieces of bedroom equipment. In the bedchamber of any comfortable house stood the washstand, a table or marble-topped stand bearing the great matched set of bedroom china, the wide basin and the tall jug or ewer, and with them the soap dish and the tooth mug and the smaller jug, on the shelf below or hidden in the cupboard, the chamber pot to match. This bedroom china was a large trade in itself, turned out by the Staffordshire potteries by the trainload, the whiteware printed in blue or brown, or many colours with flowers and scenes and patterns, handsome and cheap, the same willow or rose pattern gracing the washstand of the villa and the modest bedroom of the clerk alike. The water was cold, carried up in cans by the housemaid in the morning, or fetched by the family themselves, and the washing before bed was a brisk affair of cold water and a flannel, the face and hands and neck in a chilly room, and the dirty water, the slops, was poured into the slop pail and carried down again, one of the endless labours of the maid. It was no luxurious bathing, the Victorian wash, but it was a real attention to cleanliness all the same, and the matched flowered set of jug and basin on the washstand was one of the prettiest and most familiar furnishings of the aged. The soap that lathered in that cold water was itself a product of the new industrial age, and the soap a household used was, like its light and its linen, a quiet mark of its station. The common soap was the hard yellow or mottled bar, harsh and strong, made of tallow and soda, that scoured the clothes and the floors and the bodies of the poor. But the Victorian age saw the rise of the great soap makers and the toilet soap, the fine, gentle, sweet-smelling soap made for the skin, and sold by the cake in a wrapper, a small, affordable luxury that spread the habit of cleanliness and the pleasure of a pleasant scent down through the classes. Names that are with us yet were made in those years. Piers with its famous transparent amber soap, and the great works of Lever and others rising in the century's end, turning out wrapped tablets of scented soap by the million, and to wash before bed with a cake of good toilet soap, lavender or rose or almond, rather than with a slab of harsh kitchen soap, was one of those small daily luxuries by which the comfortable distinguished their lives from the lives of the poor. The scent of the soap, the cleanness of the skin, the small pleasure of it, last thing of an evening, was a real refinement of comfort, and the cake of fine soap on the washstand was as sure a sign of gentility as anything in the chamber. Let us turn to what the Victorians wore to sleep in, for the nightclothes too ran the whole range from luxury to nothing at all. The respectable man slept in a nightshirt, a long loose shirt of cotton or linen, or for warmth, of flannel, reaching below the knee, and very often a nightcap on his head, for the bedchamber was cold, and much heat is lost from an uncovered head. The woman slept in a nightgown of similar stuff, long and high-necked and modest, plain for the everyday and trimmed with frills and lace and fine tucks for the wealthy, the nightgown of a rich woman being a thing of beautiful and costly needlework. Over the nightgown, for sitting up in the cold or against a chill, went the bed jacket or the wrapper or the shawl, on the feet, sometimes bed socks knitted for the purpose. The flannel nightgown was the great comfort of winter, soft and warm against the skin, the fine cotton or linen the pleasure of summer, and the whole apparatus of nightwear, laid out warming by the fire and changed into at bedtime, was part of the ritual of marking off the night from the day. The poor, as we have seen, very often had no nightclothes at all, and slept in their day shirts or their underclothes. the having of a proper nightgown to change into, a garment worn only for sleep, was in itself a small badge of comfort and decency, one more line drawn between those who had and those who had not. There is a part of the night's business we must speak of plainly, though delicately, for it was a real and universal part of going to bed. The matter of the night's sanitation, in an age when the lavatory was very often far away or did not exist at all. In nearly every bedroom, beneath the bed or in the cupboard of the washstand or within a special closed commode, was the chamber pot, the necessary utensil of the dark hours, for no one was going to cross a freezing house or go out to a privy in the yard in the small hours of a winter dawn. In the grand house it was a handsome thing of matched china, emptied and cleaned each morning by the housemaid as a matter of course. In the poor house it was a plain crock shared by the whole room. The disposal of it, the carrying down and the emptying and the scouring, was one of the least regarded and most necessary of the maid's daily labours, done first thing every morning throughout the land. The closet itself, where there was one, might be an earth closet, sprinkling dry earth after each use, the invention of a clergyman much praised in its day, or in the modern and well-plumbed house, the new water closet, the flushing lavatory that was slowly spreading through the century, and that we have made the universal standard since. But for most of the age and most of the people, the night's needs were met by the pot beneath the bed, and that was simply a fact of life, thought of by no one as remarkable, an ordinary part of the ordinary night. Now to the small luxuries, the touches of refinement that the comfortable and the rich added to the bare business of going to bed, for it is in these that we see most clearly what made one bedtime a pleasure and another a mere necessity. There was scent, above all, the lavender water and the eau de cologne dabbed on at bedtime, the sweet bags of dried lavender and rose petals laid among the stored linen, so that the very sheets smelt of summer, the pot-pourri in the bowl, the faint pleasant perfume that hung about a well-kept bedroom, and that the poor, in their close and ill-aired chambers, never knew. There was the dressing-table, set out with its pretty things, the cut-glass scent bottles and the trinket trays and the candlesticks. There was the hairbrush and the comb and the hand-mirror, plain wood and bone for the modest, but for the rich, a matched set backed in silver or ivory or tortoise-shell, monogrammed and gleaming, laid out upon the dressing-table like a small treasure. There were the warm wrappers and the soft slippers, the bed-socks and the shawls. There were the little comforts of the bedside, the carafe of water and the glass, the book, the watch, the small bell to ring for the servant. None of these were necessary. All of them were the marks of a life with something to spare, the quiet accumulated refinements by which comfort became luxury, and the going to bed became not merely the end of the day but a gentle pleasure in itself. Consider the curtains, for the Victorian bed and the Victorian window were both much curtained, and the curtains had their part to play in warmth and in the long argument about health. The old four-poster had its bed curtains drawn close all round, shutting the sleeper into a small warm tent against the terrible draughts of an unheated, ill-fitting house, and there was real comfort in it, the curtained bed a snug refuge within the cold room. But as the century went on, the doctors and the sanitary reformers turned against the bed curtains, arguing that they shut in the stale breathed air and shut out the healthful fresh air, and the closed bed slowly gave way, first to the half-tester with its curtains only at the head, and then to the open bedstead of brass with no hangings at all. The window hangings stayed heavy and full, drawn close each evening against the cold and the gloom and the prying eye, but over the windows themselves a new battle was being fought, the battle over night air, for an older world believed the night air unwholesome and shut every casement tight against it, while the new reformers preached the opening of casements and the flooding of the bedchamber with fresh air as the very secret of health. The well-aired bedroom, the window open a crack even on a winter night, was the new gospel of the sanitary age, and whether to sleep shut in and warm or open and fresh was a thing the Victorians argued over as earnestly as we argue over our own notions of healthy sleep. That argument over night air was only one of many, for the Victorians thought a great deal about sleep and gave a great deal of advice about it, and the advice they gave is a window into the anxieties of the age. The household manuals and the doctors held forth on every aspect of the night, on the right hardness of the mattress, for a bed too soft was thought to weaken the body, and the growing child especially was to be laid on something firm, on the direction the bed should face, some holding that to lie with the head to the north was healthful, on the danger of sleeping in a chamber with flowers or with a fire, which were thought to poison the air, on the number of hours one ought to sleep, and the virtue of early rising, early to bed, and early to rise being preached as next to godliness. There was anxiety about sleeping too much and anxiety about sleeping too little, advice for the sleepless and warnings against the laziness of the lie-a-bed. There were the patent remedies for wakefulness and the soothing syrups, some of them laced with opium, given even to fretful babies with sometimes fatal result. The Victorians, in short, were as busy and as earnest and as contradictory about how to sleep well as any later age, and the bedtime was ringed about, not only with rituals of comfort, but with a whole anxious science of how the night ought properly to be spent. For very many Victorians, the last act of the day was not a comfort of the body, but of the soul, for this was an age soaked in religion, and prayers at the bedside were as much a part of going to bed as the putting out of the candle. The child knelt at the nurse's or the mother's knee, and lisped the simple prayers learned by heart, the commending of the soul to God against the dangers of the dark, and the ever-present chance of death before morning. The grown man and woman knelt by the bed in their night-clothes, and said their own prayers in the gloom or the candle-light before climbing in. In many a household, grand and humble alike, there were family prayers as well, the whole household, family and servants together, gathered night and morning while the master read from the scriptures and led the prayers, the one daily moment when all the ranks of the house knelt together before the same God. Religion lay close over the Victorian bedroom, the bed a place where one might not wake, sleep itself a nightly rehearsal of death, and the morning a small resurrection, and the prayer at the bedside, the giving of the unconscious hours into the keeping of Providence, was for millions the truest and most needful comfort of all, the laying down of the day's cares with the day's clothes into hands they trusted to hold them through the dark. Before the family could sleep in peace, the house itself had to be made safe for the dark, and the locking up was a nightly ritual of its own, very often the special duty of the master or the most trusted servant. There was the going round of the whole house, the trying of the doors and the bolting of them, the fastening of the window shutters and the catches, the seeing that no stranger lurked and no door stood open to the gloom. There was the banking or the raking out of the fires, a matter of real anxiety, for fire was the great terror of the age. A house lit by candle and lamp and oil and warmed by open coal fires was a house always one carelessness away from burning, and the newspapers were full of the dreadful fires that began when a candle was left too near a curtain, or a spark leapt from an unguarded grate, or a nightgown caught as its wearer leaned to the flame. And so the last round of the house was in part a hunt for danger, the snuffing of every needless flame, the setting of the fire-guard, the making sure. Only when the doors were bolted and the fires were safe and the lights were out below could the master himself climb the stairs to bed, the house shut and secured around its sleeping people, the day's last duty done. Many went up to bed with something warm inside them, for the bedtime drink was an old and comforting custom, and the cup taken last thing had as many forms as there were ranks and purses. The simplest and commonest was warm milk, or milk and water, or a cup of gruel thin oatmeal porridge, taken to line the stomach and soothe one toward sleep. There was the posset, hot milk curdled with ale or wine and spiced, an old remedy for the cold or the cough as much as a comfort. There was, for those who liked it and could afford it, the negus and the hot toddy, the wine or the spirits mixed with hot water and sugar and spice, the warming nightcap in the other sense, that sent a glow through the body before bed. As the century went on, the new drinks came in, the cocoa above all, the comforting cup of hot chocolate that the temperance reformers pressed as a wholesome alternative to the nightcap of strong drink, and that became a beloved bedtime comfort in countless homes. To sit by the dying fire with a warm cup before going up, milk or gruel or cocoa or toddy, according to one's nature and one's means, was one of the gentle pleasures of the Victorian evening, the last small warmth taken in before the cold climb to the colder bed. Reading in bed, that great pleasure of our own age, was in the Victorian time a newer and more doubtful thing, bound up with the slow improvement of the light, and frowned on by the careful for its waste and its danger. By the dim and costly flame of a candle or a rushlight, reading was a strain on the eyes and a hazard besides, the reader nodding off over the page with the candle still burning by the curtains, and so for much of the age and most of the people, reading in bed was a small indulgence, allowed sparingly, if at all. But as the brighter, steadier light of the good oil lamp and the gas spread, and as cheap print poured from the new steam presses, the habit grew, and more people took a book or a paper to bed with them, the Bible and the book of devotions for the pious, the novel in its monthly parts for the comfortable, the penny dreadful, the cheap thrilling tale of crime and horror for the young and the working reader, devoured by candlelight under the blanket. The bedside book and the bedside candle became a settled comfort of the literate classes, and the picture of a reader propped on the bolster in the lamplight, lost in a story while the house slept, is one that the late Victorians would have known as well as we do, a new small pleasure that better light had given to the night. And then, at the very last, came the putting out of the light, the small final act with which the day was truly ended and sleep begun. The fire was banked down low, the coals raked together and covered to hold their heat till morning, the fireguard set before it, and the candle or the lamp was put out, and this too was a quiet art, for a candle was not blown out, which spattered the grease and left a stink of smoke, but snuffed, pinched between wetted fingers or quenched with the little snuffer made for the purpose, or the lamp turned down till its flame shrank and died. In that moment the chamber went from the small warm circle of light to total blackness, the deep darkness we have already spoken of, and the sleeper was left alone with the shadows and the sounds of the settling house, and the breathing of whoever shared the bed. For the child there was the nightlight still burning, for the rest there was the dark and the warmth of the bed, and the long-awaited surrender to sleep. It was the same last act in the palace and the cottage, this putting out of the light, the snuffing of the day's last flame, the giving of oneself over to the dark and the rest, and with it the whole long ritual of getting ready for bed was complete, and the Victorian, of whatever rank, lay down at last to sleep. We have spoken of putting out the light, but the kindling of it deserves a word too, for the making of a flame was, until well into the Victorian age, a real labour, and the thing that changed it was one of the small revolutions of the century. Before the match, to make fire was the business of the tinder-box, the little box holding flint and steel and tinder, with which one struck a spark into the charred linen, and coaxed it with a sulphur-tipped splint into a blaze, a fiddling business of several minutes that was a misery on a cold black morning and impossible to hurry. Then, in the 1820s and after, came the friction match, the Lucifer and the Congreve, the splint tipped with chemicals that burst into flame when drawn across a rough surface, and the making of light and fire became the work of a moment, and later the safety match, that would strike only on its own box, made the thing safe as well as quick. We can hardly imagine now what it was to live before the match, to have no easy way to make a light, to keep the kitchen fire alive from year to year, because to rekindle it was such a labour, and the cheap match, the penny box of lucifers, was one of the great small mercies of the Victorian age, that let any hand kindle a candle in a moment against the gloom, though it was made, that match, in choking dangerous factories by some of the poorest girls in London, at a terrible cost to themselves that the buyers never saw. It is worth dwelling too on how very rarely the Victorians slept alone, for the solitary bedroom and the single bed that we think the natural way of things were, in that age the privilege of the few, and bed-sharing was the universal rule. Husband and wife lay together, of course, save among the rich who could afford separate chambers, but so did children, several to a mattress lying top to tail to fit, so did servants, 2 or 3 to a pallet in the attic, so did the poor, a whole family in one bedstead, so did travellers at an inn, who might be put to share with a perfect stranger, and think nothing of it. The very idea that each person should have a sleeping place and a chamber of their own was a new and growing notion, a luxury that spread down slowly from the top, and the reformers of the age pressed it hard, for the crowding of many bodies into one narrow space was held rightly to be a breeder of disease, and the moralists feared of worse. But for most of the people through most of the century, to climb into a shared and crowded bed, warm with the bodies already in it, was simply how one went to sleep, and the lone sleeper stretched out in solitude would have seemed to most Victorians a cold and friendless way to pass the night. Across the kingdom there were old regional ways of sleeping that lingered into the Victorian age, and none was more striking than the enclosed bed of the north, the box bed of Scotland, and the borders and the far country places. This was a sleeping place built like a great wooden cupboard against the wall, panelled all round and closed with doors or a curtain, so that the family climbed inside and shut themselves in, a little room within the chamber. And there was real sense in it, for in a single-roomed cottage open to every draught, it made a warm, shut private den, walled away from the cold and the company, holding the heat of the bodies within. To us it might seem close and stifling to sleep shut in a wooden box. To the Highland cottager or the northern labouring family, it was snugness itself, the warmest and most private nook in a hard and crowded home. There were the truckle beds and trundles too, the low cots on wheels that slid away beneath a greater frame by day, and were drawn out at night for the child or the servant. There were the press beds and the fold-up sort, that closed into a cupboard or a chest in the parlour by day, for in a small house, every place that could be hidden away brought back a little room to live in. The poor and the cramped were endlessly ingenious in the stowing of their sleep, and the couch that vanished by day was one of the commonest shifts of the crowded home. Among the rich, the trend ran the opposite way, toward more chambers and more privacy rather than less, and the sleeping arrangements of the wealthy married couple are a curious chapter in themselves. In the great house, as we have seen, the husband and wife very often had separate bedrooms, his and hers, with a shared dressing room or a connecting door between, each a grand private apartment of its own, and this was thought not coldness, but the height of refinement and good sense, giving each their own space and their own servants and their own undisturbed rest, with the connecting door for the private life of the marriage. The middle classes, with fewer chambers, mostly shared the marriage bed in the one bedroom, as the poor did from necessity. But the ideal that floated down from above, the notion that the truly genteel slept apart, had its influence, and the separate chambers of the rich were envied and imitated as far as a family's house would allow. To have a chamber of one's own to sleep in, a private chamber that was yours alone, was among the deepest luxuries the age could offer, a luxury of space and solitude that the crowded poor could not so much as imagine, packed as they were many to a chamber and several to a bed. Every house of any size kept a bed it did not use, the best bed, the spare chamber, the guest chamber, and the keeping of it tells us something about how the Victorians regarded such things and the giving of hospitality. The spare bedroom was kept ready and aired and waiting for the visitor, furnished often with the best the house could show, the finest counterpane and the good furniture, a point of pride and a sign of a household able to receive guests in proper style. Yet a guest place seldom slept in had its own discomforts, for an unused room grew cold and damp, the linen clammy with the chill of disuse, and so the arrival of a guest set off a flurry of airing, the fire lit in the spare chamber at last, the bed warmed long and thoroughly, the damp driven out, before the visitor could be decently lodged. In humbler homes the best bedstead served the same end, kept in the parlour or the best chamber, dressed in the family's finest, slept in only by the honoured guest, or used only at the great occasions of birth and death. The bed reserved for others, finer than the ones the family used themselves, was a quiet emblem of Victorian propriety, the household's public face turned toward its threshold, the comfort offered to the stranger a measure of the family's standing in the world. The bed was not only a place of rest, but a place of sickness and of watching, and the sick room by dark was one of the hardest and most familiar scenes of Victorian life, for illness was constant, and the sick were nursed at home. When fever or consumption or any of the many diseases of the age laid a member of the household low, the bedchamber became a sick room, and the nights were spent in watching, for someone must sit up with the sick through the dark hours, to give the medicine and the drink, to tend the fire, to soothe delirium, to be there. The women of the family took their turns, or a hired nurse was got, sitting through the long, slow nights by the shaded lamp or the night light, listening to the labouring breath, watching the face on the pillow, fighting sleep themselves in the small dead hours when the sick are said to be at their lowest, and the dying most often slip away. The sick room had its own apparatus, the medicines and the cordials on the bedside table, the feeding cup, the basin, the shaded light kept burning all night, and the nightly vigil by the sick-bed, the long lonely watching in the silent house while the rest slept, was one of the deepest and most wearing of the labours of love that the age demanded, and one that almost every family knew. And sometimes the watching by the bedside was a watching unto death, for in an age of high mortality the deathbed was a familiar place, and to die at home in one's own bed, surrounded by one's people, was the common and the hoped-for end. The family gathered, when the end was known to be near, around it in the candle-lit or lamplit room. There were the last words and the last blessings, the sending for the clergyman, the prayers. There was the long watching as the breath grew slower and the pauses longer, until the last breath was drawn and did not come again, and someone reached to stop the clock and cover the glass and open the window to let the soul go free. The Victorians did not hide death away as we have learned to do. It happened in the home, in the bedchamber, witnessed by the family including the children, ringed about with its own solemn rituals, and the bed in which a person had been born and had slept their whole life long was very often the one in which they died. The death-bed and the marriage bed and the birth-bed one and the same piece of furniture, the great stage on which the whole drama of a life was played from first breath to last. That thought that the same bed saw the birth and the sleeping and the sickness and the dying of a life is worth holding a moment, for it tells us how much more it meant to the Victorian than a mere place to sleep. A good bed was very often the most valuable thing a poor family owned, and one of the most valued things even the rich possessed, named first among the goods in many a humble will, the feather bed and the bedstead left with care to a chosen child. It was the place a woman was brought to bed of her children, in the old phrase, the place of the great labours and dangers of birth. It was where one lay through every illness, and where, at the last, one died. Born in a bed. Sleeping a third of one's whole existence away in it, sick in it, dying in it. The Victorian was bound to it by ties far deeper than comfort, and the making ready of it each night, the warming and the smoothing and the turning down, was the daily tending of the one piece of furniture most woven into the very fabric of a human existence, from the cradle, which was itself a little cot, to the grave, which was spoken of, tenderly, as a sleep and a quiet rest. Not everyone went to bed in a home, and the institutional night, the sleeping of the many under one stern roof, was a great and growing fact of the Victorian age, in the workhouse and the school, and the barracks and the ship, and the hospital and the jail. In the workhouse, where the destitute were lodged, the paupers slept in long bare dormitories on narrow hard beds, the sexes parted, the families broken up, the night ruled by bell and regulation, a comfortless rest grudgingly given. In the boarding school, the boys and girls slept in dormitories too, rows of iron beds in a cold bare room, homesick and supervised, the lights put out at the bell. The soldier slept in the barrack room, packed close in his cot or his bunk. The sailor slung his hammock between the beams of the crowded deck, swaying with the ship, learning to sleep in a space a foot or two wide amid the snores of 100 men. The patient in the new hospital lay in the long ward under the night nurse's lamp. The prisoner lay alone in his narrow cell under the rule of silence. In all these places, the sleep of the individual was swallowed up in the sleep of the institution, ordered by bell and rule and watched over by authority. The bed not a private refuge, but an allotted place in a great regimented dormitory of the poor, the young, the soldier, the sick, and the fallen. And a vast and growing number of Victorians passed their nights so, far from any hearth of their own. The hour at which people went to bed was not fixed, but shifted across the century, and it shifted, on the whole, later and later, pushed back by the very lights we have been speaking of. In the early years, and always among the poor and the country folk, bed came early, soon after dark, for there was little light to sit up by, and the labour began at dawn. 9 o'clock was a late hour, and in winter the whole household might be abed not long after the daylight failed. But as gas, and then the brighter lamps lit the evening, and as the towns filled with people whose work was not ruled by the sun, the evening lengthened and bedtime crept later, the comfortable family sitting up till 10 or 11 in the gaslight, the pleasures and the business of the evening stretching ever further into the dark. The very rich, with their late dinners and their balls and their theatres, turned the dark into day, going to bed when the labourer was rising. The labourer and the cottager still went down with the light. So the spread of the hours of bed widened across the century, the gulf between the early sleeping poor and the late waking rich growing with the spread of artificial light, until by the end of the reign the modern pattern, the long lit evening and the bedtime well into the evening, was settling into the place it holds with us. Still, there was one season that overturned all the careful arrangements of warmth, and that was the height of summer, when the long days and the short warm nights made a different thing of going to bed. Now the trouble was not the cold, but the heat and the light. The sun still up at the children's bedtime, the bedchamber under the slate stifling, the heavy blankets thrown off, the windows opened wide at last to any breath of air. In the country a summer night might be a sweetness, the window open on the scented dark, the owl calling, the cool coming at last. But in the close courts of the city, a hot summer night was a torment, the one crowded room airless and reeking, the whole family sleepless and sweating, the children crying, the streets themselves filled with people who had given up on sleep indoors, and come out to sit on the steps and the pavements in the cooler air. The poor in summer sometimes slept on the roofs or in the parks, or simply did not sleep. The comfortable retreated to the seaside or the country, and the great heat of a city summer night, before any cooling but the open window, was one of the hardest of the seasons of the poor, the reverse of the winter's cold but no kinder. In the quiet of the small hours, when the household slept, the hours were marked, and the dark watched over by sounds and figures we have almost wholly lost, and they were a comfort of their own to the wakeful. There was the clock, the long-case clock on the stair or the mantel clock in the chamber, ticking through the silence and striking the hours, a companionable voice in the still house. There was the church bell, tolling out over the sleeping town or village, and in the earlier part of the age, and in many places later, there was the watchman, the old Charlie, and then the new policeman, walking his beat through the quiet streets, calling the hour and the weather in the older towns. Past 2 o'clock and a fine night. A human voice in the gloom assuring the sleepers that someone watched while they slept. To lie awake in the dark and hear the clock strike the bell toll, the watchman call and his slow footsteps pass, was to feel the night ordered and guarded. The slow minutes counted off toward the morning, and the loss of those old voices, the silencing of the watchman's call, is one of the small ways in which our nights have grown more solitary than theirs. For some, of course, sleep would not come, and the sleepless night was as real a misery to the Victorian as to us, perhaps more so for the lack of any easy remedy. To lie awake in the long stillness, hearing the clock strike the slow hours, the household breathing all around in its rest while sleep itself refused to come, was a known and dreaded affliction, blamed on the nerves, the digestion, the conscience, the night air, the strong tea taken too late. The remedies were many and mostly useless or worse. The warm drink, the counting, the prayer, the getting up to read or walk, the patent soothing syrups and sleeping draughts of the chemist, many of them dosed with opium or chloral, that brought sleep at a price and made addicts of the desperate. The old divided night we spoke of at the beginning, the waking hour between first and second sleep, had by now been forgotten and recast as a disorder, the natural waking of the small hours become a torment of insomnia to be cured, and the sleepless Victorian, tossing in the blackness and longing for the dawn, was as wretched a figure as any our own sleepless age can show, and had fewer and crueler comforts to reach for. While the most of the world slept, a whole army was awake and at work in the dark, for the dark had its own population, and the going to bed of the many depended on the staying awake of the few. There was the watchman and the policeman on the beat. There was the baker, up in the dead of night, kneading and baking, so that the morning should have its bread. There were the workers of the markets, Covent Garden and Billingsgate and Smithfield coming alive in the small hours as the produce and the fish and the meat came in for the day. There were the night soil men doing their foul necessary work under cover of dark. There were the printers of the morning papers, the railwaymen, the sailors and the watchmen, and the nurses and the doctors called out to the sick. And there was the knocker-up, that strange forgotten trade, who for a small weekly fee went round in the gloom before dawn with a long pole, tapping at the bedchamber windows of working men to wake them for their early shifts, a human alarm clock walking the sleeping streets. The sleeping city rested on the waking of these others, the bread baked and the markets stocked and the streets watched and the sleepers woken, a whole hidden night shift of labour going on in the gloom while the curtained household slept, unregarded, toward their morning. There was an enemy of sleep more constant than insomnia, and a more loathsome one, and no honest account of the Victorian bed can leave it out. The vermin, the bug, and the flea, and the louse, that infested the beds of rich and poor alike, and made war on the comfort of the night. The bed-bug above all was the scourge of the age, hiding by day in the cracks and crevices of the old wooden bedsteads and the seams of the mattress, coming out in the dark to feed on the sleeper, leaving the itching bites and the foul, sweetish smell that told of an infested room. And few houses, however clean, were wholly free of it, for it travelled in furniture and luggage and spread from house to house through the crowded towns. The war on the bug was endless, the taking apart and scalding of the bedstead, the painting of the joints with turpentine and corrosive washes, the hunting of them by candlelight. And here was one more reason for the triumph of the iron and brass bedstead over the old wooden one, for the metal frame gave the bug nowhere to hide and could be wiped and scalded clean, a real advance in the comfort and decency of sleep. Though for the poor, in their old beds and their crowded chambers, the vermin remained a nightly torment that no amount of labour could quite defeat. It is worth standing a moment in the middle of a Victorian bedroom and looking about us, for the chamber itself, where there was a chamber set apart for sleep, was furnished and arranged in ways that say much about the life lived in it. Beyond the bed and the washstand, the comfortable bedroom held the great wardrobe or the clothes press for the hanging of the garments, the chest of drawers for the folded linen, the dressing table with its glass, a chair or two, a small table by the bed. On the walls hung pictures and, very commonly, the framed religious text or the sampler, the improving words worked in wool or printed and hung where they would be seen first thing and last. Thou God seest me, or prepare to meet thy God, or the gentler God is love on the floor, a strip of carpet or a rag rug by the bed to spare the bare feet the cold boards, the chamber pot and the slop pail, the candle or the lamp, perhaps the family Bible or the prayer book by the bed, the clothes laid ready for the morning over the chair. It was a plainer and barer room than ours, the Victorian bedroom, cold and ill-lit and sparely furnished by our measure, and yet it held the whole private life of its people, their sleep and their prayers and their sickness, and their love and their death, and it was, for all its plainness, the most intimate room in the house. The very youngest had their own bedtime and their own bed, and the cradle and the cot were the first beds any Victorian knew, ringed about with custom and anxiety. The new baby slept in a cradle, the old rocking cradle on its bowed runners that could be set going with a foot while the hands worked, or hung in a swing cot, and it slept much in its parents' room, in the cradle by the bed, or, very often among the poor and the comfortable alike, in the bed itself between its mother and the wall, to be fed and warmed through the dark. The broken rest of a house with a young baby were broken nights, the thin cry in the dark, the mother roused to feed and change and soothe, the walking up and down with the fretful child, the same the world over and the age over. And where the family could afford it, there was the nurse to take the night work, or in the grand house, the wet nurse who suckled the child in the mother's stead. The swaddling of earlier ages, the binding of the infant tight, was fading now, the baby more loosely and warmly wrapped, and against the dangers of the night, the overlying and the chill and the convulsion that carried off so many infants, the mother watched with the old anxious tenderness, for the cradle stood very close to the small grave, and a baby got safe through the dark was a baby got safe one more night toward its uncertain chance of life. To send the small child down into the hush of sleep, there were the old soft tools of the lullaby and the bedtime tale, the oral comforts that cost nothing and were given freely in the poorest home as in the richest. The lullaby, the cradle song, was as old as motherhood and sung in every cottage and nursery. The slow, soothing tunes worn smooth by countless mothers, Hush-a-bye Baby, and Rock-a-bye, and the rest, the words half nonsense and the purpose all in the gentle rocking sound of it. And with the lullaby came the bedtime tale, the story told in the firelight, or the gloom to ease the child towards sleep, the old fairy tales and the rhymes, the comforting and the half-frightening both. There was the Sandman who came to throw sand in the children's eyes and make them sleepy. There was wee Willie Winky running through the town in his nightgown, rapping at the windows and crying through the locks to know if the children were abed. There was the whole soft law of going to sleep that the grown ones passed to the small ones at the edge of the dark. It was one of the deepest and tenderest of human customs, the singing and the telling of the child to sleep, and it bound the generations together in the firelit dark, the same songs and the same tales handed down, that the child soothed tonight as its mother had been soothed in her own childhood, and as she would soothe her own. There were many in the Victorian world who slept where they worked, for the living in of servants and apprentices and shop workers was common, and some of the oddest sleeping places of the age were behind the counters of the shops and the workshops. The apprentice and the shop assistant very often lodged in their master's house or over the shop, and slept where they could, under the counter, in the stockroom, on a truckle, in a back room, in a dormitory over the premises with the other young men of the trade. The conditions were frequently wretched, the hours cruelly long, the bed a mean shakedown got to late and left early. The great drapery and grocery houses lodged their living-in assistants in barrack-like dormitories above the shop, ruled by fines and rules. The small tradesman's apprentice slept in a corner of the workshop among the tools and the goods. To sleep at the place of one's labour, with no home to go to at the day's end, and no division between the working day and the resting hours save the closing of the shutters, was the lot of a great many young people in the towns, and their cramped and comfortless and ill-regarded sleep, packed into the spaces behind the bright shop fronts, but one more of the hidden labours on which the comfortable day of others was built. For those who had left home but had no household of their own, there was the lodging, the let room, and the landlady who ruled it, a whole world of Victorian sleeping that the novels have made familiar. The single clerk, the governess, the student, the widow, the worker, come to the town, took a chamber or a share of a chamber in a lodging house, furnished by the landlady with a bed and the necessary things, and there made what home they could. The bed-sitting room, where one slept and lived in the one chamber, the bed by day disguised or curtained off, was the lot of the genteel poor and the unmarried striver. The landlady provided the chamber and the cleaning, and very often a meal or two, and presided over the comings and goings with a sharp eye and sharper rules, that the lodger's bed was no longer their own in the old family sense, but a thing rented and shared and governed by another's house. It was a lonely way to sleep, very often, the let room far from one's own people, the bed in a stranger's house, and the figure of the solitary lodger climbing to a cold hired room at the day's end, no family about them, and no home of their own, was one of the characteristic and rather melancholy figures of the growing impersonal town. The Victorians were fascinated by what happened in the mind once the candle was out, and the world of dreams and nightmares held for them a deep and uneasy interest, half science and half superstition. Dreams were pondered and recorded and interpreted. The old belief that a dream might be an omen or a message lingered alongside the new attempts to explain it by the workings of the brain and the body. The heavy supper, or the troubled conscience throwing up its phantoms in the dark. The nightmare proper, the night terror, the sense of a crushing weight and a presence in the blackness, and the inability to move or cry out, was a known and dreaded affliction, blamed on the rich food or the bad air or, in the old way, on the demon that was once thought to sit upon the sleeper's chest. Children were beset by the bogey and the terror of the dark, the grown by their own phantoms, and the whole shadow world of sleep, the dreams and the nightmares and the strange wanderings of the sleeping mind, was a country the Victorians explored with the same earnest curiosity they brought to everything, even as they lay, like all of us, helpless and unknowing within it through the watches of every night. And then, at the far end of the dark, came the morning and the waking, for every going to bed looks toward a getting up, and how one was woken was as much a mark of one's station as how one was put to bed. The labourer and the servant were woken in the black cold before dawn, by the knocker up at the window, by the factory bell or the works hooter calling across the waking town, by the cock and the first light, by the housemaid herself, rising first of all to light the fires before the family stirred. The comfortable family was woken more gently and far later, the maid bringing up the can of hot water and drawing the curtains and lighting the fire so that the chamber was warm and the water ready before they so much as opened their eyes. The rich woke latest of all, in their own time, to the soft ministrations of their servants. The same dawn that dragged the servant shivering from her attic let the master sleep on in his warmed and curtained comfort, and the manner of the waking, the rough early summons of the poor, and the soft late waking of the rich, closed the long dark as unequally as it had been entered, the gulf between the ranks holding firm from the putting out of the light to the drawing of the curtains in the morning. Then, behind all the comfort and the custom there ran, through the later part of the age especially, a great earnest movement to reform the very places people slept in, for the sanitary reformers had come to see the bedchamber as a battleground for health, and their gospel slowly changed the Victorian bedroom. They preached against the closed and stuffy bedroom, the shut window, the curtained bed, the crowding of many bodies into one ill-aired room, which they rightly saw as breeders of the consumption and the fever that killed so many. They preached for fresh air and ventilation, the open window, the airing of the bed and the chamber, each morning, the parting of the sexes, and the easing of the dreadful overcrowding of the poor. The well-aired, single-occupied, properly ventilated bedroom became the new ideal, urged in the manuals and the lectures and the model dwellings the reformers built. The housemaid's morning duty of stripping the bed and throwing wide the windows to air, the chamber became a settled rule of the careful house. It was slow work, and the worst overcrowding of the poor would outlast the age. But the long Victorian campaign for the healthy bedroom, the fresh air and the room of one's own, and the clean and ventilated place to sleep, was one of the quiet revolutions of the century, and the comfort and the health of every bed we sleep in now owe it a debt we never think to pay. There was one bedroom in the Victorian year that stood apart from all the rest, the holiday bedroom, the strange bed in the strange place that the spread of the railways and the seaside holiday brought within reach of more and more people, and the sleeping in it was a small adventure. To go away to the seaside lodging or the country inn or the visited relation's spare chamber was to sleep in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar room with its own smells and sounds and its own hard or soft mattress. The sea heard through the window all the strange town's noises about him, and there was a particular pleasure and a particular unease in it, the holiday freedom mixed with the faint disquiet of the bed not one's own. The seaside landlady and her lodgings became a national institution and a national joke, the cramped chambers and the hard beds and the rules, but for the clerk's family escaped for a week from the smoke of the town. The strange bedroom with the sound of the sea in it was a part of the wonder of the holiday, the falling asleep to the waves and waking to the gulls, a memory carried home and treasured. The holiday bed, the once-a-year strangeness of sleeping somewhere else, was a small new pleasure of the age of the railway and the seaside, and a reminder of how much of the feeling of a bed lies simply in the familiarity or the strangeness of the place we lay our heads. Of all the enemies of a comfortable Victorian bedtime, the cold was the most constant and the most universal, and the dread of the cold bed in the cold room shaped the whole ritual of the winter evening. In a house warmed only by its open fires, the bedchamber in winter was bitterly chill, the heat of the day's fire long gone, the frost-forming ferns of ice on the inside of the window panes, the water frozen in the ewer by morning, and to undress in such a room was a brave, quick business. The clothes shed and the nightgown pulled on in a shiver, the dive beneath the covers as fast as decency allowed. The chill brought its own small miseries. The chilblains on the fingers and the toes that throbbed and itched by the fire, the frozen feet that would not warm, the reluctance to put so much as a nose outside the blankets once one was in, and all the apparatus of warmth we have spoken of, the warming pan and the hot brick and the stone bottle, the piled blankets and the eiderdown and the nightcap and the bed socks, was the long human answer to this nightly siege of the frost. To get warm at last deep in the bed with the chill driven off and the body's own heat gathering under the heaped covers was one of the keenest comforts the winter could give, the more precious for the chill it had conquered. And the memory of that warmth, won against the freezing dark, is one of the deepest pleasures the Victorian bedroom has handed down to us. The marking and the keeping of time ran on through the dark, and the management of the household's clocks and watches was a small nightly duty in itself, for time did not keep itself in an age of springs and weights. The clocks were wound, the long case clock on the stair, and the bracket clock on the mantel, many of them needing their nightly or weekly winding with the key, a small ritual very often reserved to the master of the house as a mark of his governance. The watch was wound and laid by the bed or hung on its stand or slipped beneath the pillow, its faint ticker companion in the dark. In the night the clocks told the hours to the wakeful, striking through the silent house, and the man who woke not knowing the hour might reach for the watch and strike a light to read it, or lie counting the strokes of the hall clock. Time was a more effortful thing then, wound and tended and read by candlelight, not the silent, untiring clock of our own age, and the winding of the clocks last thing at night, the setting of the watch by the bed, was part of the putting of the house in order for the night. The keeping of the count of the hours through the unconscious night toward the morning. Hair, that we have seen the great lady's maid attend to, was a nightly care for almost everyone, and the dressing of the hair for bed had its own customs across the sexes and the ranks. The woman's long hair, uncut through her whole life and dressed up elaborately by day, had to be let down at bedtime unpinned and brushed out, the brushing held to be good for it as well as needful, and then plaited or bound loose for sleep so that it should not tangle into a hopeless mat by morning. Those who wished their hair to curl set it before bed in the old days in curl papers, the hair twisted up in little screws of paper, or later in the rag curlers, strips of rag knotted in, an uncomfortable thing to sleep on, but the price of the morning's ringlets. And over the lot went the nightcap, or the cap, or the kerchief, to keep the dressed hair tidy and clean against the pillow. The man had his own attentions, the brushing, the care of the whiskers and the moustache that the age so prized, sometimes even the moustache band or trainer, worn in bed to keep it in shape. The hair let down and brushed and bound, the curls set, the head capped, was part of the unmaking of the day's appearance, the careful tending of that crowning glory that the Victorian, man and woman both, took such pride in. There is a small object we have mentioned in passing that deserves its own moment, the chamber candlestick, the flat candlestick with the wide saucer base and the ring handle and the little snuffer, for it was the very emblem of going up to bed, through the lit chambers below the household, moved by lamp and gas, and the branched candlesticks. But to go up to bed was to take up one's own chamber candlestick from the row of them, set ready, light it, and carry one's own small flame up the unlit stairs to the dark bedroom, the one moving point of light in the sleeping house. There is something deeply evocative in that image. The figure climbing the stairs by the wavering light of the single flat candle, the shadows swinging up the stairwell, the rest of the house dark. It was the universal gesture of bedtime in the houses of the comfortable, repeated each evening in every such home in the land, the taking up of one's own light to find the way to bed. And at the top the candle set by the bed, the undressing in its small light, and then the snuffing of it and the dark. The chamber candlestick carried up full and bright was carried down in the morning, a stub by the housemaid, to be cleaned and made ready once more. Let us go back once more to the great house and look at the evening that came before all that retiring, but the going to bed of the rich was the close of a long and ordered evening of its own, a ritual of leisure that the labouring poor could not imagine. After the long and formal dinner, the company rose and the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, leaving the gentlemen to their wine in the old separation of the sexes after dinner. Then the gentlemen rejoined the ladies, and the evening passed in the drawing-room, in the genteel amusements of the hour, the music at the piano, the singing, the cards, the conversation, the reading aloud, the games, until the tea or the last light refreshment was brought in. Only then, the evening's leisure spent, did the company think of bed, and the candlesticks were taken up, and the good night said, and the procession up the stairs began. It was an evening built wholly around comfort and society, and the filling of the lit hours with pleasure, the very opposite of the poor man's evening, that was merely the short tired gap between the day's labour and the early bed, and the leisured drawing-room evening, the music and the cards, and the ease before the unhurried retiring, was itself one of the deepest luxuries of Victorian life, the luxury of time and warmth and light and company, to be spent simply in the pleasure of the lit evening before sleep. Not all who could afford comfort slept in a family home, for the age had its bachelors and its single gentlemen who lived in chambers and clubs, and their nights had a character of their own, free and solitary both. The single man of means took rooms, chambers in the Inns of Court or lodgings in the better streets, or a set of rooms kept for him, where he lived attended by a landlady or a manservant or the chamber's own staff, or he belonged to one of the great clubs where he might dine and pass his evening, and even in some take a bedroom for the night. His going to bed answered to no one, late or early as he pleased, no family to consider, his comfort seen to by hired hands. There was a freedom in it that the married man with his household might envy, and a loneliness in it too. The well-appointed room with no one in it, the bed that no one had warmed with waiting, the bachelor in his chambers, the single gentleman climbing to his solitary comfortable room at whatever hour suited him, was a figure the age knew well, half enviable and half forlorn, and his particular night, comfortable and free and alone, was one more of the many ways the Victorian passed from the day into the dark. Out in the country, on the farm, the going to bed kept closest of all to the old ways, ruled still by the beasts and the seasons and the early rising labour of the land. The farmhouse went to bed early and rose early, for the cows must be milked at dawn, and the work of the land waits for no one. The evening was short. The family gathered by the kitchen fire for the brief hours between the day's end and the bed, the men perhaps to the settle, and the women to their mending, the one lamp or the candles lit sparingly. The beasts were seen to last thing, the stock settled for the evening, the dog let out and in. The house was locked, the fire banked, the family climbed to the cold chambers under the thatch or the slates. The farm night was wrapped in the deep country dark, and the country silence we have spoken of, the only sounds the wind and the stir of the beasts and the owl, and the farmer and his people sank into their early sleep, close to the rhythm of the earth, to rise again before the light, their rest the least changed of any in the changing century, the old rural bedtime going on in the deep countryside much as it had gone on for hundreds of years. When all is said of the comfort and the custom and the manufacture and the rank, the bed meant something to the Victorian that ran deeper than any of it, for the bed was the place of refuge, the one corner of the world where a person might at last be private and at rest. For the labourer worn out by the day, for the servant at the end of her endless round, for the child, for the sick, for the troubled, the bed was the place to which one withdrew from the whole demanding world, the warm dark refuge where the cares might be laid down, and the body and the soul might rest, and in an age when privacy was scarce and life was hard and the day was long, that withdrawal into the bed each evening was a daily deliverance, longed for and sweet. To draw the curtains, to put out the light, to lie down at last in the warmth with the day shut out, was to come home to the deepest refuge the world afforded, the small warm country of the bed. And whatever their rank, and however hard or soft their resting place, in that longing for the bed at the day's end, that gratitude for the repose, all the sleepers of the Victorian night, the Duchess and the crossing sweeper alike, were one. We have spoken of light as a precious thing, but it is worth dwelling on just how carefully it was rationed, for the economy of the candle and the coal ruled the evening of all but the rich, and left its mark even on our language. In the careful household, light was doled out with real strictness, one candle or one lamp to a room, and that put out the moment it was not needed. The children sent up to undress in the dark, or by the landing light, to save a candle of their own. The family gathered into one lit room of an evening rather than scattering and lighting several. To burn the candle at both ends was to waste in reckless folly the precious stuff that should be hoarded. To sit up late burning light and coal was an extravagance the thrifty frowned on. The very phrase "not worth the candle" came from the reckoning of whether a thing done by candlelight earned back the cost of the light it burned, and the coal was reckoned as closely as the candle, the fire in the one room and none upstairs, the scuttle watched, the grate banked low, for light and warmth were money burned up into the dark and gone, and the managing of them, the eking out of the evening's light and heat against the cost, was one of the constant small arts of the Victorian household, woven so deep into the life that it shaped the very hours people kept and the very words they spoke. Step into a Victorian bedroom with your eyes closed, and it is the smell of it that would tell you most, for every such room had its own deep scent built of the life lived in it. There was the cold, first of all, the particular smell of a cold, unheated room, of damp plaster and stone. There was the tallow, or the wax of the snuffed candle, the paraffin of the lamp, the coal smoke where there was a fire. There was the scent of the bedding, the clean linen smelling of the lavender laid by with it and the open air it had dried in, or, in the poor and crowded room, the sour smell of unwashed bedding and close-packed bodies and the chamber pot. In the ladies' room there was the perfume, the eau de cologne and the lavender water and the pomade and the fine soap. In the nursery the milk and the warm child smell. In the sick room the medicines and the camphor and the sad close smell of illness. The smell of a bedroom told you at a breath the rank and the cleanliness and the very health of the household, from the lavender sweet and well-aired chamber of the careful rich to the foul close reek of the overcrowded slum, and the clean cold lavender-scented air of a well-kept Victorian bedroom is one of those vanished sensations that those who knew it remembered all their lives with a pang of longing. For the poorest, the very bedding was not a fixed possession, but a thing that came and went with the fortunes of the week, in and out of the pawnshop. For the bed was often the only thing of value a poor family had to raise a little money on. The blankets and the sheets, the one decent coverlet, even the bed itself, were pawned on a Monday when the last of the wages was gone, to be redeemed, if luck held, on a Saturday when the new wages came, and pawned again the next Monday, round and round, and in the lean weeks they were not redeemed at all, and the family slept cold under their coats while the blankets lay in the pawnbroker's store. To pawn the bedding was to choose between the present hunger and the bed's warmth, a choice the poor were forced to make again and again, and a family that had pawned its blankets in the depth of winter, and lay shivering under rags while its only warmth hung ticketed on a shelf across the street, knew a hardship that the comfortable, piling on their Whitney blankets and their eiderdowns, could not begin to imagine. The bedding in and out of pawn was one of the bitterest rhythms of the life of the poor, the very warmth of the bed mortgaged week by week to the need of the day. There was one night in a life that stood apart from all others, the wedding night, the first night of the marriage bed, and the Victorians ringed it about with silence and significance both, as the threshold of the new married life. The bride, brought up very often in a careful ignorance that the age thought proper, came to it with little knowledge and much trepidation. The nuptial couch itself, the new bedstead of the new household, was a thing of importance given or bought for the marriage, the place where the future of the household would begin. We will draw the curtain there, as the age itself drew it, for the privacy of it was deeply guarded, and the Victorians spoke of such things scarcely at all. But it is right to mark the wedding night among the nights of a lifetime, the beginning of the shared bed and the shared chamber, and the long partnership of the marriage, the bride and groom left at last alone in the curtained dark at the start of their years together. The bed that would see the births and the sicknesses and perhaps the deaths of the years to come was first lain in on that night, the long story of a marriage begun in the dark of the bridal chamber. And as a marriage began in the shared bed, so too often it ended in the couch emptied of its sharer, for the widow and the widower knew the particular grief of the empty side, the cold half of the bed where the other had lain. To lose a husband or a wife was to lose the companion of the night as well as the day, to lie down alone in the bed that had held two for so many years, the warmth and the breathing and the nearness gone, the cold reach across to the empty place, a small fresh wound each evening. The widow in her black, the widower in his loneliness, climbing each evening to the bed that was now too wide, was a figure the age knew all too well, for death came early and often, and few long marriages were not ended by it. And the Queen herself, when her own husband died, became the most famous of all such mourners, keeping his room and his things as he had left them, and grieving the empty place for 40 years. The empty side of the bed, the cold place where love had lain, was one of the quietest and deepest of human griefs, known in the cottage and the castle alike, the loneliest reach of all the long reaches of the Victorian night. Some of the strangest beds of the age were not in Britain at all, but moving across the ocean, for these were the years of the great emigrations, when millions left the country for the new worlds across the sea, and they slept, for the long weeks of the voyage, in the bunks of the emigrant ship. Down in the steerage, the cheap crowded quarters below decks, the emigrants were packed into tiers of rough wooden bunks, 2 and 3 high, a narrow hard berth apiece, strangers crammed close in the dark, and the stench and the heaving of the ship, the seasickness and the bad air and the crying children, and the want of any privacy or comfort at all. For the weeks of the crossing this was the bed, the hard bunk in the reeking hold rolling with the swell, the only refuge a curtain or a blanket hung for a scrap of privacy, and many died in those bunks, or the fevers that swept the crowded ships and were buried at sea. To lie in an emigrant's bunk in the dark of the steerage, the known world left behind, and the new one not yet come, the whole life one owned reduced to the bundle under the head, was one of the hardest and most hopeful of all the ways the people of these islands lay down to sleep in that restless century, the bed between two worlds. It is worth pausing, since we have touched on her grief, on the bedtime of the Queen herself, for even the highest in the land had to lie down and sleep, and the royal evening had its own famous shape. In the years of her marriage, the Queen and her husband shared, by her own devoted choice, against the grand custom of separate rooms, and their domestic evenings at Windsor and at Osborne and at Balmoral, the music and the drawing and the quiet family pleasures before bed were the model the whole admiring nation tried to follow. And when her husband died, so young, the Queen's night became a long monument of grief. She kept his room exactly as it had been, his things laid out, the water set ready, as though he might return. She slept, it was said, with his portrait at her side and his nightclothes near. She mourned in the great curtained royal beds for the rest of her long life. The most powerful woman in the world went to her bed each evening as a widow and a mourner for 4 decades, and there is something deeply human in it, that the queen who ruled a quarter of the earth was, at the going out of the candle, only another grieving woman lying alone in a too-wide bed, the royal night, for all its grandeur, ruled by the same love and loss as the humblest in her realm. And every morning the labour of the evening before had to be undone, and the bed and the room set to rights, for the making of the bed and the airing of the room was one of the first and most universal of the morning's tasks. The housemaid, or the woman of the house, threw back the covers and stripped the bed to its mattress and flung the windows wide to air the bedding and the room in the fresh morning air, the new gospel of health. The mattress was turned regularly so that it should wear evenly and not hollow. The underbedding was shaken and smoothed, and then the bed was made up afresh, the sheets drawn tight and tucked, the blankets and the quilt laid on and squared, the pillows plumped and set, the whole made neat and smooth and inviting for the evening to come. The slops were emptied and the washstand cleaned, the grate raked and the room dusted and swept, and the bedchamber, the scene of the night's intimate disorder, was restored to its daytime order and propriety, ready and waiting, made up, aired and smoothed, for the whole long ritual to begin again at the next day's dusk. So the bed was unmade, and made night and morning, day after day, in every house in the land, the endless turning of the great wheel of waking and sleeping that carries every life, and each age, around and around. We have praised the soft feather bed and pitied the hard straw one, but it is worth knowing what filled the mattresses of the great middle of the nation, for the trade in bedding stuffing was a large and curious one. Below the costly down and feathers lay a whole world of cheaper stuffings, each with its makers and its merchants. The horsehair, curled and springy and long-lasting, the best of the affordable fillings, sorted and cleaned and prepared in its own works, the wool flock, the torn and shredded waste of the cloth trade, and the cotton flock from the cotton mills packed into the common mattress, the coir, the coconut fibre newly come from the east, springy and cheap, the chaff and the straw of the poorest beds, stuffed from the harvest and renewed each year. There was an anxious side to this trade, for the cheaper stuffings were sometimes filthy, made of rags and sweepings and worse, gathered from no one knew where, and the reformers worried over what the poor were laying their heads upon. A mattress was only as wholesome as the stuff inside it, and the stuff inside the cheap ones was very often a mystery best not inquired into. From the eider down of the rich to the road sweepings of the poorest tick, the filling of the bed was a long ladder of comfort and cleanliness, and the softness a body sank into at bedtime was bought, quite literally, by the pound. The more one paid, the softer and sweeter and cleaner the stuff that bore one up. Before some beds, on some evenings, came the bath, for the washing of the whole body, as opposed to the brisk wash at the basin, was an occasional production rather than a nightly habit, and the bath before bed was a small labour of its own. There was no bathroom in most houses, no taps running hot. The bath was the portable tub, the hip bath or the long bath of painted tin or zinc, carried into the bedroom or set before the kitchen or bedroom fire and filled by hand, can after heavy can of water, heated on the kitchen range and carried up the stairs. To take a bath was to set the servants or oneself to the long labour of heating and carrying the water, and then of emptying it again afterward, and so a full bath was a thing taken weekly at most in the comfortable home, and far more seldom among the poor, who might manage no more than the basin and flannel from 1 month's end to the next. But to sink into a warm bath before the bedroom fire on a cold evening, the steam rising, the firelight on the water, and then to be wrapped warm and dry and carried straight to a warmed bed, was a luxury of the deepest kind, the clean, warm, relaxed body sliding between clean sheets, and the occasional bath before bed, for those who could command the labour of it, was one of the great comforts of the Victorian night. The bed of the comfortable Victorian was not merely furnished, but dressed, draped, and decorated, for the upholsterer's art lavished itself on it, as on no other piece of furniture. And the dressing of it was a matter of fashion and display. Even as the closed four-poster gave way, the half-tester and the grander bedstead kept their hangings, the valances and the canopy of rich stuff, the chintz or the damask or the dimity, chosen to match the window curtains in the room. There was the valance hiding the space beneath the frame, the tester or canopy overhead, the drapery looped and tied. The whole was made up to be looked at as well as slept in, the counterpane smoothed and squared, the pillows set just so, a composed and handsome sight by day, the centrepiece of the chamber. In the grand house the upholsterer dressed it in the height of costly fashion. In the comfortable home the mistress took pride in the work herself, the pretty matching stuffs, the crisp white counterpane that showed the care and the taste of the house. The dressing of the bed was one more of the ways comfort shaded into display. The bedstead, a thing of beauty and pride as well as of rest, draped and presented like the lady it bore. The Victorian night had its terrors as well as its comforts, and chief among the pleasurable terrors was the ghost, for this was the great age of the ghost story, and the haunted bedroom was its favourite scene. The Victorians loved to be frightened in the safety of the lit room, and the ghost story told round the fire of an evening, especially at Christmas, was a beloved custom, and the stories they told were full of haunted chambers, the cold spot in the spare room, the figure at the foot of the bed, the footstep in the passage, the door that opened of itself, the dead come back to the room where they had died. There was real belief mixed with the pleasure, for the age that nursed its dead at home and watched them die in the family bed did not find it so very strange that the dead might linger. The haunted house and the haunted bedroom were taken half in earnest, and many a servant in a cold attic and many a child in a dark nursery lay rigid with a fear that was not all pretence. To climb to a bedroom said to be haunted, to lie in the dark in a strange old house listening to its creaks and settlings, was a real ordeal of the nerves, and the ghost story and the haunted chamber are woven deep into how the age felt about the night. The dark bedroom, a place where the comfortable warmth of the bed and the cold breath of the supernatural lay very close together. A house at night was seldom wholly without its animals, and the dog and the cat had their own places in the sleeping household, their own small parts in the going to bed. The dog might sleep in the kitchen by the banked range, or in the yard or the stable on guard, or, the favoured house dog, on a rug in the hall, or even in a basket in a bedroom. A warm and faithful presence in the gloom, its sharp ears kept watch while the family slept, and its bark was the first alarm against the intruder and the fire. The cat had the run of the shadowed house, the silent hunter keeping down the mice that would otherwise gnaw at the stores and run in the walls, curling by the dying kitchen fire when its work was done, slipping out into the yard and in again. In many a cottage the cat shared the children's bed for the warmth, a purring comfort in the cold. The beasts of the house settled to their own rest as the family settled to theirs, the dog sighing on its rug, the cat curled in the warmth, the canary covered in its cage against the dark, and the small sounds and presences of the animals were part of the deep fabric of the sleeping house, the warm breathing company of the creatures that shared the human night. Spare a thought for the old, for age has its own hard relation with sleep, and the bedtime of the aged and the infirm was a tender and a wearing matter in the Victorian home. The old slept lightly and wakefully, troubled by the aches and the cold and the small hours' loneliness. The very old and the bedridden lived half their lives in the bed, propped on their pillows by the window or the fire, tended and turned and fed by the women of the family. To get an infirm old person to bed was a labour of love and patience. The helping up the stairs, or the settling in the downstairs bed, the warming and the propping and the seeing to, the long vigils of the old were broken and uneasy, the dawn longed for, and the very old, near the end, often kept to a bed brought down to the warm living room, to be near the family and the fire, the chimney corner of the aged, where the grandmother or the grandfather dozed and watched and waited out their last seasons in the heart of the household. The nights of the old, the wakeful, aching, lonely watches, and the long days half spent in the bed, was one of the quieter sorrows of the age, tended with a patience and a duty that the close-knit Victorian family for the most part gave without question. The old seen to their rest by the young, as they had once seen the young to theirs. It is the little things within reach of the bed that make the difference between a bare rest and a comfortable one, and the well-found Victorian bedside had its small array of comforts gathered close. On the little table or the chair by the bed stood the chamber candlestick with its matches and snuffer, the one light to be lit in the night, the carafe, or the tumbler of water for the nighttime thirst, the watch ticking, telling the hours, the book or the Bible for the last reading or the first, perhaps a small bell to ring for help, or by a sick bed, the medicines and the feeding cup. There might be the spectacles folded by the candlestick, the handkerchief, the small comforts of the individual. Over the chair, the clothes laid ready for the morning, under the bed, the necessary utensil, and perhaps the box of treasures or the chamber pot. These few things within arm's reach, the water and the light and the watch and the book, were the furniture of the wakeful hours, the comforts gathered close against the helplessness of the night, so that the sleeper, waking thirsty or frightened or unwell in the dark, had the simple remedies to hand, and the well-arranged bedside, everything in its place and within reach, was one of the quiet kindnesses of a well-kept house, the night's modest needs provided for before the light was put out. And under all of it, through the whole house, ran the faint sounds of the night, the settling noises of a sleeping home that were themselves a kind of lullaby to those who lay awake. There was the tick and the strike of the clock. There was the creak and the crack of the old timbers as the house cooled and settled in the dark, the small reports that the nervous took for footsteps. There was the shift and the sigh of the fire sinking in the grate, the fall of a coal. There was the breathing of those who shared the bed and the room, the dog's sigh, the cat's soft tread, the wind in the chimney, the rain on the glass. From outside came the muffled sounds of the night world, the far watchman, the late cart, the church clock, the dog answering dog across the dark, and within the deep quiet of the resting house, broken only by these small familiar noises that told the wakeful all was well. To lie in the stillness and listen to one's own house settling around one, the clock and the fire and the timbers and the breathing, was one of the deep, gentle comforts of the night. The sleeping home alive with its low sounds about its resting people, holding them safe in the familiar dark until the morning. There is a deep bodily relief in the shedding of the day's clothes, and for the Victorian, bound and buttoned and laced into far more clothing than we wear, the undressing at bedtime was a real and welcome loosening. The woman, especially, released at last from the corset that had gripped her all the long day, drew the first full breath of the evening as it was unlaced. The body let out of its stays into the soft freedom of the nightgown. Off came the heavy layers, the gown and the petticoats and the underthings, the boots that had pinched and the garters that had bound, until the body stood free and easy in its shift at last. The man too shed his stiff collar, and his tight boots and his many-buttoned layers with relief, the constriction of the formal day given up for the loose ease of the nightshirt. To be undressed, unlaced, unbound, to feel the air on the skin and the body's own shape return to it after the long day's harness, was a pleasure in itself, the first ease of the coming evening, and the slipping into the soft, loose nightgown, warmed by the fire, was the body's own signal that the day's labour and its display were over, and the time of rest had come. For all the warmth that the flame gave, it carried a constant danger that haunted the Victorian bedroom, and the dreadful accidents of fire and the burning of clothing were a real and terrible feature of the age. The open flame was everywhere, the candle carried up to bed, the lamp on the table, the fire in the grate, and the loose flowing nightgown and the long hair and the trailing wrapper were forever a stray movement away from catching alight. The newspapers told again and again of the woman or the child whose nightdress brushed the candle or the fire and went up in a sheet of flame, of the dreadful burns and the deaths that followed. The young and the old and the infirm were most at risk, the child reaching for the candle, the old woman dozing too near the grate, and the fireguard before the bedroom fire, and the care with the bedtime candle were no idle fussing, but a real defence against a real and horrible danger. It is one of the prices the age paid for its lights, the constant peril of fire, that the very light and warmth that comforted the sleeper could in a moment turn to terror, and the flameless, cold, safe light we take so for granted has spared us a whole category of dread that lay close beside every Victorian going to bed. The bed itself changed with the seasons, for in a world without the steady warmth of our own, the bedding was a thing to be added to and taken from as the year turned cold and warm again. As the autumn came on and the evenings drew in, the extra blankets were brought out from the press where they had lain through the summer, the heavy winter quilt and the eiderdown laid on, the flannel sheets in some houses replacing the cotton, the whole bed built up against the coming cold. And as the spring returned and the evenings grew mild, the layers were stripped away again. The winter bedding washed and aired and folded with lavender into the press, the bed lightened for the summer. There was a real art in it, the judging of the night's warmth against the bedding, the adding of a blanket on the first chilly evening, the throwing off of the eiderdown when the thaw came. The bed was tuned to the season like an instrument, and the comfort of the bed depended on getting it right, neither sweating under winter blankets in a warm spell, nor shivering under summer covers when the frost came early. The seasonal building up and stripping down of the bed was one of the housewife's regular tasks, the turning of the bedding with the turning of the year, the warm nest made ready against the frosts and opened up again for the summer. Some nights were made for staying up rather than going to bed, for the year had its watch nights and its vigils, the evenings when the household sat up late or saw the dawn, and these were marked off from the ordinary round of early sleep. There was Christmas Eve, when the children were sent early, but the grown ones sat up late, hanging the greenery and filling the stockings and keeping the old customs. There was the watch night at the year's end, when the pious gathered in the chapels to pray the old year out and the new year in, and the rest sat up to hear the midnight bells ring in the new year, before going late and merry to bed. There were the evenings of the great events, the illuminations and the bonfires, when the whole town stayed up. There were the wakeful nights of trouble and of joy, the eve of a wedding, the coming of a birth, the watch beside a deathbed. To stay up, to keep the candles burning past the usual hour, to see the midnight or the dawn, was itself a kind of event in lives ruled by the dawn, a breaking of the nightly rhythm that marked it out as special, and the watch night and the vigil, the staying up against the natural pull of sleep, were among the small punctuations that lifted certain evenings out of the long ordinary round of going down early and waking betimed. Not every homecoming at night was a gentle one, for the age had its drink and its drunkards, and the late stumbling return of the man who had spent the evening and the wages in the public house was a dark and common feature of the age, especially among the hard-pressed poor. The public houses and the gin palaces blazed with light and warmth, a refuge from the cold, cheerless home, and many a man drank there till closing and rolled home late through the dark streets to the wretched room where the wife waited, the money gone, the children hungry, and the drunken homecoming, the noise and the temper, and too often the violence, turned the evening from a refuge into a terror for the woman and the children who feared the sound of the unsteady step on the stair. The reformers and the temperance crusaders fought the drink with all their might, for they saw in it the ruin of the poor man's home and the poor woman's evening, and that the contrast between the bright, warm public house and the cold, dark home it emptied was one of the bitterest of the age. The drunkard's return was the shadow side of the homecoming. The evening made fearful rather than peaceful, and it darkened the going to bed of more humble households than the comfortable ever knew. We have spoken of the children of the comfortable in their warm nurseries. Spare a fuller thought for the children of the needy, for their bedtime was a very different thing, and there is no part of the age that touches the heart more. The pauper child went to bed, if bed it could be called, in the one crowded room, on the shared mattress or the floor, in its day clothes for want of any other, packed close with its brothers and sisters for warmth. There was no nursery, no nurse, no bath before the fire, no warmed nightgown, no nightlight against the dark, very often no supper to go to bed on. And yet the poor child too was a child, and was loved, for the most part as fiercely as any. The tired mother sang it the same old lullabies, told it the same tales, gave it what comfort she had, and the child, knowing no other life, took its rough bed and its hungry sleep as the way of things, and dropped off as children will into the deep sleep of the young, clutching a younger sibling or a scrap of comfort, dreaming whatever the poor dream. The picture of the ragged child asleep in the corner of the bare cold room, dirty and hungry and yet at rest, loved by its weary mother and oblivious of all it lacked, is one of the most poignant the age has left us, and a reminder that the deep human need for sleep and the deep human gift of love are met, somehow, even in the hardest of places. At the very end of the age, in a few rooms here and there, a strange new light began to glow that would change the world of sleep forever, for the electric light was coming, and with it the beginning of the end of the whole world of flame we have been travelling through. In the last years of the century, the first electric lamps appeared, in the grand houses and the public buildings and the great new shops and theatres, a cold, steady, brilliant light that did not flicker or smoke or smell, that could not set the curtains alight, that came on at the turn of a switch, and those who first saw it knew dimly that the long reign of the candle and the lamp and the gas was ending. The electric bedside lamp, the light one could turn on and off without leaving the bed or striking a match, the light that banished the dark utterly and safely, was the future, though it would take long years to reach the ordinary home. But its coming was already changing the very meaning of sleep, loosing at last the old tyranny of the light that had ruled how people slept since the beginning of the world. We who lie in our lit rooms and read by our bedside lamps and banish the dark with a touch are the heirs of that change, and the Victorians, with their candles and their night lights and their vast surrounding dark, were the last people to go to bed in the old way, on the very threshold of the lit age we now take for our birthright. There is one great labour of the bedroom we have not yet spoken of, and it comes not at night, but in the bright lengthening mornings of the spring, when the worst of the winter is past, and the whole house is given over to the turning out. The bedrooms suffer it hardest of all, for they have been shut and warmed and breathed in through every cold month, and to the mind of the age, more and more as the century wears on, a long slept-in room is a room grown unwholesome, its air gone stale and close, its corners harbouring the unseen matter that was believed to breed low fevers and decline. So when the spring comes, the beds are stripped down to the bare frame, and the heavy mattresses are heaved out over the sills or carried down to the yard to be beaten in the open, the dust rising off them in grey clouds under the steady blows of the cane. The blankets are taken to be washed, a slow and streaming business that fills the scullery for days. The hangings come down from around the bed, and the curtains from the windows. The carpet, where there is one, is rolled and dragged out to be flung over a line and thrashed. In the plainer houses, the very walls of the chamber are lime-washed afresh, a clean wet coat of white laid over the smoke stain and the damp of the year, and the floorboards beneath the bed that no eye has seen since the last spring are got at on hands and knees with scrubbing brush and pail. Then the whole room is flung wide to the wind and the sun for a day and a night, together, to air and sweeten and lose the closeness of the winter before it is built up again. It is raw, aching work, and it falls, like nearly all the work of the bedroom, upon the women and the maids of the house. Yet there is a deep contentment to be had in it too, the contentment of the clean and emptied room set in order once more, the bed made up fresh and high, the linen sweet from the line, the long shut-in winter scoured clean away, and the chamber ready, as it were, to begin the year again. Come closer now to one small art that nearly every household once practised, and that has all but vanished from the living world, the proper putting out of a light. We who have only to touch a thing upon the wall can scarcely picture how much care the last flame of the evening once asked of a person. A candle is not simply blown at, or not if it can be helped, for to blow it sends a long trail of foul smoke and the rank stink of the smouldering wick across the room, and it may spatter the hot grease beside. The careful way is to snuff it, and for this there grew up a whole small family of tools. The snuffers proper are a kind of scissors with a little covered box set upon the blades, made to crop the charred and toppling end of the wick and catch it neatly as it falls. For the cheaper candles must be trimmed thus again and again as they burn, or they gutter and drown themselves in their own grease and smoke. And to put the flame out at the last there is the extinguisher, that little cone of metal upon its own handle, or hung ready upon the candlestick, which is brought down gently over the flame to smother it without smoke or smell. In the rich houses these small things are wrought in silver, and kept polished bright upon the dressing table. In the cottage a finger and thumb, wetted on the tongue and pinched quick and sure upon the wick, do the very same office, and the first trusting of a child with that pinch is a small rite of growing up. The chamber candlestick itself is shaped low and broad in the foot against tipping, with a ring to bear it by, and often a little upright guard to shield the flame from the draught of the stairs, a thing made for one purpose alone, the carrying of fire up into the dark to bed, and the setting of it down in safety at the journey's end. To put out the light was the closing act of the whole day, the shutting of that ring of brightness, the deliberate letting in of the night. Let us step now for a short while out of the houses of home altogether, and into the bedroom that belongs to no one, the hired room of the inn and the hotel, where the traveller lays his head in a strange bed among strangers. For the Victorian who went much about the world, the commercial traveller with his cases of samples, the family upon its summer journey, the man of business far from his own town, a great many evenings were spent in a room never seen before and never to be seen again, and the age felt the strangeness of that keenly. The first dread of every careful traveller was the damp bed, for a bed left long unslept in might have stood cold and moist for weeks, and to lie in damp sheets was held, and rightly, to be a true danger, a sure way to wake with a chill that could deepen into something graver. So the wary guest would ask to have the sheets aired before the fire under his own eye, or thrust a hand down between them to feel for the telltale clamminess, or in the older coaching inns call for the warming pan to be run through the bed before he would trust himself to it. The chambermaid carries up the brass can of hot water and the bedroom candle. The boots bears off the muddy boots to be blacked and returned by dawn, and then the traveller is left alone in a room full of unfamiliar smells and unfamiliar shadows, the framed print he does not know upon the wall, the window giving on a yard he has never seen by day. There is a particular loneliness in such a room, the loneliness of the bed far from home, that many a private diary and many a letter of the age sets quietly down. And there is a particular gratitude, too, at the end of a long and jolting journey, in a clean inn and a dry, well-warmed bed, and a fire burning in the little grate, a kindness shown to a stranger at the close of the day that the traveller marks down and remembers with warmth long after, the simple mercy of good shelter among people who owed him none. Now let the season turn hard against us, into the dead heart of the winter, into the iron frosts of January, and let us think of the bedroom at the cruellest time of the year. For in the great mass of the houses of the age, the room where people slept was a cold room, and on a hard evening in the depth of winter it was bitterly, achingly cold. We have seen already that a fire in the bedchamber was a luxury of the rich, or a mercy kept for the sick room, and that the most of the people climbed each evening into rooms where no fire had ever once been lit. In such a chamber, on a still and frost-bound evening, the cold is a thing you feel the instant the door is opened, a deep and waiting chill that has settled into the walls and the boards and the very weave of the sheets, so that the first touch of the bed is like the touch of stone. The water standing in the ewer upon the washstand may freeze clean through in the small hours, a pane of grey ice across it that must be cracked and broken before a face can be washed at morning. The breath smokes white in the light of the candle, and across the inside of the window the frost draws out its strange and delicate forests, feathered and branching fronds of ice that the children wake to and press their wondering faces near, lovely to look upon and meaning bitter frost without. In such a room there is no lingering at all over the undressing. The day clothes come off and the nightgown goes on at speed, and the shivering body is got beneath the heaped covers as swiftly as it may be, to begin the slow patient labour of warming one small hollow of the freezing bed by its own animal heat. The brick heated in the hearth below, or the stone bottle filled and wrapped in a strip of flannel, is worth more on such an evening than its weight in silver, a little core of borrowed warmth to curl the cold feet around. And the chilblains come, the hot itching swollen redness upon the fingers and the toes and the rims of the ears, the very brand of the cold house winter, borne by almost everyone and eased by almost nothing. To have lain warm in bed through a Victorian winter was no little thing. It was a comfort dearly bought, and unknown for the blessing it was. And there is one last kind of sleeper of the age we should not pass over before we draw to a close, the one who lay down each evening in no house at all, but in the far service of the Queen, the soldier and the sailor away at the ends of the empire. For the sailor, the bed is the hammock, that long slung cradle of canvas hung from the deck beams overhead in the close crowded space between the guns, a thing the new navy kept from the old. There is a real and learned art to the getting into it, and the lying easy in it, for the untaught man is pitched straight out upon the deck on the far side, while the practised hand lies square and snug as the ship works beneath him, the hammock hanging always level while the whole world heaves and tilts around it, so that a man is rocked the night long by the very motion of the sea. And in the grey of the dawn the call is piped along the deck to lash up and stow, and every hammock is rolled and corded tight with its single blanket bound within, and stowed away in its netting, so that the whole sleeping place of hundreds vanishes in minutes, and the deck stands clear and bare for the work of the day. The soldier has it harder yet upon campaign, the one thin blanket and the bare hard ground, the leaking tent in the rains or no roof but the open sky, the broken hour of sleep snatched between the watches with the boots still laced upon his feet. And the soldier at home in his barracks lies in a long bare whitewashed room of iron cots ranged in their rows head to foot, his every hour from the rising to the lying down marked out for him by the call of the bugle, little enough that he might call his own. For all of these, far from the warm and particular bed remembered from boyhood, their rest was a rougher and a colder business than it was for those who slept safe within 4 still walls at home. And it was the thought of home, of one certain room and one certain bed left far behind, that a great many of them carried down with them into sleep beneath the unfamiliar stars, the same longing for a known and gentle resting place that has lived in the heart of every soldier and each wanderer since the world began. We have spoken much of where the stuff of the bedroom was made, in the brass works of Birmingham and the blanket mills of Whitney and the spinning towns of the north. Let us now think for a moment of where it was bought, for in the Victorian age there rose up, as never before, the great shop given over wholly to the furnishing of the home. In the large towns, and above all in London, there grew vast emporia, whose names became household words, Heels and Maples and the like, whose business was the bed and all that went with it. A family of the prospering middle sort, setting up a new house or marrying off a daughter, would make a day's expedition of it, and walk through long galleries hung with curtains and ranged with bedsteads of every kind, the iron and the brass, the half-tester and the French, the plain and the grand. There were whole floors of mattresses to be pressed with the hand, and judged rooms stacked to the ceiling with blankets and quilts and counterpanes, counters heaped with linen sheets to be reckoned by the dozen. It was a new thing in the world, this, the buying of one's comfort ready-made, and all in one place, chosen at leisure from a great abundance laid out to tempt the eye. The shopman, deferential and knowing, would lead the family from piece to piece, naming the qualities, quoting the prices, folding back a corner to show the working within. And the goods, once chosen, would be delivered by the shop's own van to the very door, carried up the stair by the shop's own men, and set in place so that a whole bedroom might be furnished in a morning's walk and a week's waiting. To the woman of the house, it was a pleasure and a power, the choosing and the ordering of the family's rest, and the catalogue of such a shop, thick as a book, and sent out by the post, brought the same abundance within reach of those in the country towns who could never come up to London to see it for themselves, and the age being what it was, a restless and inventive and improving age, the bed became a field for the patent and the new device, for the Victorians loved a patent comfort, as they loved few things besides. The advertisements of the day are thick with marvels for the bedroom, each one warranted to give a sounder and a healthier sleep than any that went before. There were the spring mattresses, the great improvement of the century, the coiled wire and the woven web that gave beneath the body and rose again. There were patent bedsteads that folded away by day, or turned by a clever hinge into a couch or even a writing desk, much prized in the cramped lodgings of the towns. There were pillows stuffed with every novel substance the inventors could devise, and bolsters warranted against the damp, and curious frames and rests for the invalid, that could be cranked and tilted to ease the long hours of the bedridden. Above all, the age loved whatever it could call hygienic or sanitary, those great watchwords of the time, and the bedding trade learned to stamp the words upon everything it sold. There were sanitary mattresses that could be opened and aired, and hygienic flock warranted clean and free of the old adulterations, and woven wire beds praised because no vermin could harbour in them, and they could be wiped and scoured. Much of it was sound, and a real advance, and much of it was mere puffery dressed in the language of health and science to loosen the careful householder's purse. But all of it shows the deep Victorian faith that comfort and cleanliness could be bought and improved and perfected, and that the right bedstead and the right mattress, chosen with care and a little money, might hold disease itself at bay, and buy a better and a longer rest. Now let us turn to a graver use of the bed, for the bed of the age was not only the place of nightly sleep, but the place where the great passages of life were met, and chief among them the coming of a child. For the Victorian woman, the bearing of children was the work and the danger of her married years, and it was met almost always at home and in the bed. As her time drew near, the best bedroom would be made ready, the room set in order, clean linen got in, the cradle brought down from wherever it had been stored since the last time. The monthly nurse was engaged, a stout and capable woman who would come to live in the house for the lying in and the weeks after, to tend the mother and the new child through the perilous early days. And in that room behind a shut door, with the nurse and perhaps the doctor or the midwife in attendance and the husband banished to pace below, the thing was done that every soul in the land had once been the occasion of. It was hard and it was dangerous. Many a mother did not rise again from that bed, and the age knew it, and the shadow of it lay over every confinement. Afterward came the long lying in itself, the weeks the new mother kept to her bed, and her room by the strict custom of the day waited upon, recovering her strength, the baby beside her, the curtains often kept drawn against the light. The same bed that was the place of nightly rest was thus also the place of birth and of the gravest danger and the deepest joy, and the room around it, for those weeks, became the whole anxious centre of the household's hopes. Spare a thought too for the narrow and particular comfort of the genteel poor, and of those who ended their days upon the charity of others, in the almshouse and the like. The almshouses, those rows of small old cottages founded by some long-dead benefactor for the aged poor of the parish, gave to a fortunate few a decent and a private end. Each old soul or old couple with their own small room and their own bed and a little coal, sheltered and self-respecting, spared the dreaded workhouse. It was a frugal comfort, the almshouse bed, plain and hard and the room often cold, but it was their own, and there was a dignity in it that the pauper in the great bare ward could never know, the dignity of a door that shut and a bed that belonged to oneself. And there was a whole class of poor that clung above all things to the keeping up of appearances, the shabby genteel, the clerk on a few shillings, the widow on a tiny annuity, who would go cold and hungry sooner than be thought to have sunk, and for such the bedroom and its furnishing were a battlefield of pride. The good bedstead, the decent sheets, the counterpane kept whole and clean, these were the outward signs that the family had not fallen out of respectability, and they were defended and maintained at a cost the world never saw. To keep a proper bed, however bare the cupboard, was to keep one's place among decent people, and the slow parting with such things, the bedstead sold, the sheets gone to the pawn and not redeemed, was the quiet measure of a household sinking. There is one last picture to set before you in this gallery of beds, and it is one of the tenderest of all, the bed kept for best in the home of the labouring poor. In a great many cottages and town tenements, where the family slept crowded as they might, there was yet kept, if it could at all be managed, one good bed, the best bed, set in the front room or the parlour, the room reserved for Sundays and for show. This was the proudest possession of the house, the high bedstead with its clean white counterpane and its plumped-up bolster, often never slept in at all from one year's end to the next, but held made up and spotless as the visible token of the family's decency and care. It would be shown to visitors with a quiet pride. It would be the bed where a guest of honour might lie, or where the dead of the family were laid out, or where the mother went for her lying in, and the keeping of it clean and whole and white, amid all the hard wear and the crowding of a poor home, was a labour of love and of self-respect that the women of such houses gave gladly. To us it may seem a strange thing, a good bed kept empty while the family squeezed into worse, but it was not strange to them. It was the one fine thing they had, the standard held flying over a hard life, the proof to the world and to themselves that however little they had this, and they tended it well, and there's something in that small white bed, kept bright through every want, that tells more of the heart of the age than all the silk and the eiderdown of the great houses together. Between the clothes of the day and the nightgown of the bed there lay a whole small wardrobe of in-between things, the soft and comfortable garments of the evening and the early morning, and they were a quiet pleasure of the age that we should not overlook. Chief among them was the dressing-gown, the wrapper, the loose warm robe thrown on over the night-clothes for the cold passage between the fireside and the bed, or worn of a morning, while the hair was done and the day's stays not yet laced. For the gentleman there was the smoking jacket and the figured dressing-gown of wool or quilted silk, an item of some splendour in a prosperous house. For the lady the wrapper or peignoir, looser and easier than any daytime dress, in which she might take her early tea or sit at her glass. These were the garments of the unguarded hours when the body was let out of the day's tight harness and allowed to be at ease. And there were smaller comforts still, each with its humble part to play in the warming of a cold house evening. There were bed socks of soft wool, drawn on against the chill of the sheets. There were bed jackets, little quilted or knitted spencers to keep the shoulders warm for one who must sit up in bed, by far the coldest way to lie, for the invalid or the nursing mother or the reader of a last chapter. There were shawls kept folded at the bed's foot to be pulled up in the night, and mittens for the hands of those who felt the cold most, the old and the ailing. None of these things was grand, and the poorest made shift with whatever scraps of warm stuff they had. But in a world of cold rooms and unheated chambers, the soft wrapper and the woolen sock and the warm bed jacket were among the small kind mercies by which people made the long winter evenings bearable, and they were valued accordingly. Now we come to the greatest change of all in the long history of the Victorian bedroom, the change that, more than any other, set the modern world apart from everything that went before, and that is the coming of piped water and the bathroom. For the whole of the age, as we have so far described it, the getting of water and the getting rid of it were labours of the human back and arm. Every drop used in the bedroom, for the washstand and the basin and the hip bath before the fire, was carried up the stairs by hand, can by heavy can, by the housemaid in the morning, and again at dusk. And every drop of dirty water, and the contents of every chamber utensil, was carried down again, the slops of a great house, making a weary and unending round of work for the lowest of its servants. But across the closing decades of the century, first in the grand new houses and then, slowly, more widely, there came the marvel of water laid on, piped up to the very bedroom floor, and with it the fitted basin that filled at a turn and emptied down a pipe, and at last the bathroom itself, a room set apart with its great fixed bath that ran hot and cold from a tap and drained away of its own accord. It is hard now to feel what a wonder this was, the end of the carried can and the emptied slop, the hot bath to be had without the heating of a single kettle or the filling of a single jug. To the servants, it was a deliverance from one of the heaviest of all their daily labours. To the family, it was a new and almost unimaginable ease, the body to be washed and bathed in warmth and plenty at the turning of a hand. Yet it came slowly and unevenly, as such things do, and it divided the comfortable from the rest as sharply as anything we have seen. For decades the fitted bathroom was the mark of the modern and the well-to-do, while the great mass of households went on in the old way, with the ewer and the basin and the weekly tub of water heated on the kitchen range and carried through, and the privy or the earth closet down the yard. The full coming of the bathroom and the piped supply to every home lay beyond the close of the age, a labour of the century that followed, but its beginning, in the last Victorian decades, was the first dawn of the comfort we now take so wholly for granted, and the slow ending of the long age of the carried can and the cold morning wash in a frozen room. There is one more thing to be said before we gather up the whole, and it concerns not the stuff of sleep, but the mind of the age toward it. For the Victorians thought about sleep, and they thought about it with a certain sternness. Theirs was an age that prized industry above almost every virtue, that held idleness to be the root of half the evils in the world, and this cast a long shadow over the soft and idle business of the bed. To rise early was counted a mark of character, almost of grace. The proverbs of the time are full of it. The early bird and the early riser, the man who would be healthy and wealthy and wise, the lie-abed, the sluggard who clung to the warm sheets when he should be up and doing, was a figure of moral reproach, held up to children as a warning, preached at from the pulpit and the schoolroom alike. The great self-help writers of the day, the apostles of getting on and bettering oneself, were unanimous that the day must be seized at its earliest hour, that the time stolen from sleep was the very seed corn of success, and that to lie soft and late of a morning was to throw away the one thing given equally to rich and poor, which was the hours of the day. Whole tracts were written upon the duty of rising betimes. The keeping of dawn hours was bound up with piety, with self-command, with the whole earnest project of making something of one's life, and under this stern doctrine there ran always a faint unease about the bed itself, about its softness and its warmth, and the way it tempted a body to linger. The bed was a needful thing, but a dangerous comfort, to be used and risen from briskly, not wallowed in. And yet, for all the preaching, the people loved their beds, as people always have, and always will. Beneath the stern doctrine of the dawn there ran the deep and simple human pleasure of the warm bed on a cold morning, the stolen 10 minutes, the reluctance to put a foot to the icy floor, the longing through a hard day for the hour of lying down at last. The diaries and the letters of the age, for all its sermons, are full of the love of bed, the relished warmth, the blessed rest after labour, the bed spoken of as the dearest friend and the surest comfort a hard world had to give. The age might frown upon the sluggard and exalt the early riser, but its heart, like every human heart, knew the truth of the matter, that there are few kindnesses in all of life so deep and so welcome as a warm bed at the end of a long day, and that to sink into it gratefully is not idleness at all, but one of the oldest and the truest of human comforts. A house at night holds more sleepers than its people, and we should not climb to our own rest without a thought for the other creatures bedding down under the same roof, for they too had their places and their ease in the order of the Victorian evening. The dog, in many a household, was the first line of the house's defence, put out in the yard or settled across the threshold or curled on a sack by the kitchen range, his ears half awake through the dark hours, his low growl or sudden barking, the thing that woke a household to a prowler at the door. The cat had the freedom of the house and chose her own warm corner, the dying embers of the kitchen fire, the airing cupboard among the warm linen, the foot of a bed if she could win her way to it, and earned her keep by the silent war she waged all night upon the mice that shared the larder and the wainscot. In the parlour, the caged bird had its own small ritual of rest, for the canary or the linnet that sang the daylight hours away was quieted at dusk by the drawing of a cloth over its cage, shutting out the lamplight and bidding it sleep, so that the covered cage in the corner became one of the small settled signs that the evening had come, and the house was winding down. And out beyond the house, in the mews and the stable, the larger creatures took their rest, the horse that drew the carriage or the cart standing in its stall in the warm animal dark, bedded deep in clean straw by the groom or the carter who had rubbed it down and fed it last thing, the whole quiet building breathing with the slow breath of the beasts and snug with their warmth. For the people of the age lived far closer to their animals than most of us do now, and the bedding down of the creatures was woven through the bedding down of the household, a part of the same nightly settling. The last round of a careful man or a careful servant took in the beasts as well as the doors and the fire, a look in at the horse, a word to the dog, the cat shut in or let out, the bird's cloth drawn, and only when every living thing beneath the roof, the two-legged and the four-legged and the feathered alike, was fed and warm and settled for the dark, was the house truly closed and quiet, and given over wholly to sleep. There is a wholeness in that picture, the whole small commonwealth of a household at rest together, that speaks of a way of living now largely gone, when the warmth of the beasts and the watchfulness of the dog were a part of the very comfort and safety of going to sleep. There is a deeper meaning in the bedroom of the age that we have touched upon, but should name plainly, and it is this, that for a great many people the bedroom was the one place in all the world where they might ever be truly alone. In a society where the poor were crowded many to a room, and the servants lived their whole lives under the eye of others, where privacy of any kind was the rare possession of the few, the having of a room of one's own, a door that shut, a space that was one's own and no one else's, was a thing deeply longed for and seldom won. To the servant in her shared attic, to the child among a heap of brothers and sisters, to the lodger behind a curtain, the dream of a private room was the dream of a kind of freedom, a corner of the world where one might at last lay down the long performance of the day and simply be oneself, unwatched. And where it could be had, that solitude was treasured above almost any other comfort, for the bed in a room of one's own was not only a place of rest for the body, but a refuge for the whole hidden inward self, the one small kingdom where a person, however lowly, was sovereign and at peace. And there is one sound of the Victorian evening we have not yet named, and it was among the most dreaded of all, the knock upon the door in the small hours, the summons that called a person from a warm bed out into the dark. For the doctor and the midwife, and the parson and the nurse, sleep brought no certain rest. For at any hour the messenger might come hammering, breathless and afraid, to call them out to a birth or a sudden illness or a deathbed across the parish. And they would rise in the cold and dress by candlelight and go out into the streets, leaving the warm bed behind, on errands of life and death. And for the household roused by such a knock, there was a particular dread in it. The candle hastily lit, the anxious voices on the stair, the bedroom turned of a sudden from a place of rest into a place of crisis. To be called from sleep in the dead of night was in an age without the easy summons we now command a grave and often a fearful thing, and the safe unbroken night, the one that brought no knock and no alarm, was counted among the quiet blessings that the fortunate enjoyed and seldom thought to be grateful for. When all is gathered up, what was it that made one Victorian bedtime a luxury and another a bare hard necessity? And the question is worth answering plainly, for it draws the whole long journey together. It came down, in the end, to a few simple things, each of which we have seen along the way, to warmth, the fire in the bedroom, and the warmed bed, and the piled blankets and the eiderdown, against the cold that was the poor man's constant enemy, to softness, the feather bed and the sprung mattress against the straw and the boards, to light the clean bright lamp against the guttering dip and the rushlight, to cleanliness, the fresh washed linen and the aired room and the fine soap against the foul bedding and the close reek of the slum, to scent, the lavender and the cologne against the stench of the crowded court, to privacy, the room of one's own against the many to a bed, and to service, the many waiting hands that smoothed the rich man's path to his rest, against the lonely labour of the poor woman who did it all herself or went without. Warmth, softness, light, cleanliness, scent, privacy and service. These were the rungs of the long ladder of comfort that ran from the Duchess to the doss house, and a life's whole station could be read in how many of them a person commanded at the going down of the day. And yet, at the top of every rung, and the bottom of every one, the same tired body lay down in the same hope of rest, and that is the thing to carry with us now, as we ourselves begin to think of sleep. Picture it now, the way you never could in life but can so easily in the mind, the whole country at the close of the day, seen as if from far above, as the dusk comes on and the lamps are lit and then, one by one, put out again. Across the cities the gas flares up street by street as the lamplighter goes his round, and in 10,000 windows the small flames bloom, candle and lamp and rushlight, the lit face of the nation at its evening. Then, slowly, as the hours go by, they begin to go dark. The grand houses of the squares put out their lamps floor by floor as the household climbs to bed. The long terraces of the clerks and the shopkeepers darken one parlour at a time. The courts and the crowded lanes, never well lit to begin with, gutter down to nothing, and the country lies under the night with its million roofs, the mansion and the cottage and the bleak ward of the workhouse, all of them holding their sleepers under the same wheeling stars, and under all those roofs, however far apart their daytime stations, the people are doing the same few simple things. They are taking off the clothes of the day. They are loosening whatever the day has bound. They are seeking what warmth they can find, the lady in her aired and curtained bed, the labourer under his thin grey blanket, the pauper child pressed against the warm flank of a brother for want of any covering at all. They are putting out the light. They are closing their eyes against the dark. The whole long story we have followed through this evening, the wax and the tallow, the linen and the down, the makers in Birmingham and the weavers of Whitney, and the spinning mills of the north, all of it comes down at the last to this one human act, repeated across the sleeping land as it has been repeated each evening since there were people in the world to do it. The lying down, the letting go, the giving of oneself over into sleep. And here, if nowhere else in all the waking world, the high and the low are drawn level. For sleep is the one country that asks no rank of anyone at its border. The same heaviness settles on the eyelids of the great lady and of the worn girl who warmed her bed an hour before. The same soft forgetting takes the rich man behind his bed curtains and the man who has nowhere to lay his head but the lean of a rope in a crowded cellar. Whatever a body owned or wanted when the sun was up, when it lies down at the last and the breath begins to slow, it is only a tired creature seeking its rest, no more and no grander than any other tired creature in the dark. There is something deeply consoling in that, I have always felt, that for all the hard divisions of the daylight world, the night comes down kindly, and the same over everyone, and gathers the whole of us in together. And it is gathering you in now. For all this long while, as we have wandered through the lit and shadowed rooms of a vanished time, you yourself have been quietly settling, sinking a little deeper into your own warmth and your own stillness. So let us leave the others to their rest, the whole sleeping country to its long night, and let me turn the last of my care to you alone, and walk you down the final gentle steps into sleep. Settle yourself, then, however you lie most easily, and let the bed take the whole of your weight. There is nothing left for you to hold tonight. Let your shoulders ease down a little further from your ears. Let your hands lie open and loose. Let the long muscles of your back and your legs grow heavy and slack, one after another, the way warmth fills a room when the fire is lit, unhurried, finding its way into every corner. Let your jaw soften, and the small tightness around your eyes let go. You need do nothing at all now but breathe, and even that is happening without your asking. Slow and easy, in and out, each breath a little longer and a touch softer than the one before. Let the day go now, all of it, the things done and the things left undone. They will all keep until the morning. They have no claim on you here. Whatever was said, whatever was carried, whatever turned over and over in your thoughts through the busy hours, let it loosen and slip away. The way the lamp slipped out across the country a moment ago, one quiet window at a time. There is nowhere you must be. There is nothing you must mend. The whole machinery of the day has wound itself down to stillness, and you may set it all aside and simply rest. Feel the warmth that is gathered close around you, the heat your own body has made beneath the covers. The chill of the wider night shuts safely out beyond them. Somewhere in the house of the mind a fire is sinking to its embers, the coals banked low and glowing a deep red under their soft fall of ash, settling now and then with a faint sigh as they cool. Let that be the picture you hold as you sink further, the dim red glow, the gentle heat, the dark growing soft around it. The last small flame is guttering low. Watch it lean and dim and gather itself, and then, with the lightest breath of shadow, go quietly out. And in the dark that follows there is nothing fearful in it at all, only softness, only rest. You are held as safely as any sleeper, under any roof in all the wide sleeping land. Let your mind drift loose of the room, out past the walls, out over the hushed and darkened country we have travelled together this evening, the whole of it gone down at last into the very sleep that is rising in you now. You need follow none of it any further. You need keep your hold on nothing. The long thread of the day is loosening, finger by finger, and you are sinking gently below the level of thought, below the reach of care, down into the warm and boundless dark, down past the wax and the embers, down past the makers and their patient wares, down past the long story and the lit rooms and the slow turning of the year, into the still deep place at the bottom of the night, where there are no rooms and no ranks and no sentries at all, only the slow tide of your own breathing and the soft enormous quiet. There is nothing now between you and sleep. It has been waiting for you, patient, this whole while. Let yourself go down into it, soft and complete. You are warm, you are safe, you are held, and you are gone. I will leave you to your sleep now, and I will keep my voice low as I go. Let me say only this before I do. The lives we have looked in upon tonight were real, every one of them, the grand and the humble alike, and I have done my best to gather them back from the old letters and the household account books and the worn diaries and inventories, and to lay them before you as truly as such things can still be known. If the few hours we have spent together have been a comfort to you, and you find you would like to come back to another quiet evening like this one, then you are most welcome to follow along, and I will go on looking through the old records and the half-forgotten histories, and bringing back whatever I find there, so that there will always be another night like this waiting for you, whenever you have need of it. Sleep well. Stay warm. Be kind to the people in your house. And I will see you in the next one. Good night.